Have you ever watched an action-packed Hollywood film where an airplane gets a hole in its side and everyone starts freaking out? Stuff starts flying all over the place and people are barely staying in their seats. Well, in real life, a small hole in the plane's body isn't going to cause that much drama. However, I have an incredible story to tell you about a pilot who actually managed to land a plane with half of its roof missing. Can you believe it? Make sure your seatbelt is fastened because this one is going to be a wild ride. On April 28, 1988, a Boeing 737 owned by Aloha Airlines took off from Hilo International Airport en route to Honolulu. Before this flight, the plane had already flown 3 short trips from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Everything was chill that day, and the weather was nice and calm. It looked like smooth sailing all the way. The captain of the flight was Robert Schornsteimer, and the co-pilot was Madeline Tompkins, both experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours in the Boeing 737. Bright and early that morning, before taking off from Honolulu, Madeline did the regular pre-flight inspection and said that everything was good to go. At 11 a.m., they took off from Honolulu and went to Maui, then Hilo. When they got to Hilo, they didn't leave the cockpit or check the plane from the outside. It wasn't a requirement, so why bother? At 1:25 p.m., the plane took off for the final leg of the round trip, with 95 people on board. 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who sat in the observer seat in the cockpit. The plane had taken off like normal and reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet without any hiccups. But then, 26 miles from Kahului, things went totally haywire. The pilots heard a loud whooshing sound, followed by a crack, and then a rush of wind that was so loud it was deafening. Turns out, a small section of the roof on the left side had come loose, causing the plane to decompress explosively. And to make matters even worse, the decompression caused a chain reaction that led to a huge chunk of the plane's roof ripping off completely. That missing part was a massive 18.5 feet long and was part of the skin that covered the plane from the cockpit all the way back to the forewing area. The pilots didn't have a clue what was going on when the disaster struck. The first officer, who was the one in charge of the plane at that time, suddenly felt her head snap back, and then she saw a bunch of gray insulation and debris flying around the cockpit like it was a tornado. Meanwhile, the captain took a look around and was shocked to see that the cockpit door was nowhere to be seen, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring straight up at the sky. The plane started to tilt from side to side, making it challenging to keep it under control. The crew in the cockpit quickly put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over control of the plane. He then initiated an emergency descent towards the nearest airport on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were seated, and most of them had their seatbelts fastened since the seatbelt sign was still on. Unfortunately, the 3 flight attendants were caught off guard. One of them was near the hole and was pulled out of the plane. The other 2 were thrown to the floor, with one of them hitting her head hard and losing consciousness. The third attendant tried to help the passengers and keep them calm. At the same time, the pilots were desperately trying to let air traffic control know that they were in trouble. But there were communication problems even between themselves due to the loud noise and the fact that they were wearing oxygen masks. They had to resort to hand signals to understand each other. Moreover, they were unsure whether their messages were being heard by ATC. The plane's controls were not responding properly, which made the captain's job of flying the plane even harder. The first officer was doing her best to assist the captain and communicate with the tower. It was only after the plane descended to an altitude of 14,000 feet that the controller finally received their distress call and immediately started making arrangements for an emergency landing. The control tower wasn't prepared for a situation like this, though. In fact, the tower had to call 911, just like any other regular person would do in case of an emergency. The problem was that the controller didn't understand the severity of the situation, and they didn't realize that the passengers and crew members would need medical help. This was because the crew had only reported a rapid decompression and hadn't explained the entire situation in detail. The plane was in a very bad mess, but the captain was doing everything he could to safely land the plane. As they descended towards the airport, The captain commanded the first officer to lower the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't turn on. The plane also had an issue with the left engine, which failed as they approached the runway. Despite these problems, the captain used the reverse thrust of the working engine to try and land the plane. It was a difficult and dangerous task, but they managed to land the plane safely on the runway. The passengers and crew members were then evacuated from the plane. It was a miracle that everyone survived. However, 65 people were injured. They had been hit by debris and pieces of the plane's body that were flying around. Unfortunately, the ground staff wasn't aware of the severity of the situation and didn't have enough resources to provide immediate medical assistance to the injured passengers. The first ambulance arrived 7 minutes after the plane landed, which wasn't an ideal scenario. Furthermore, there were only 2 ambulances on the entire island, which couldn't accommodate all the injured people. As a result, tour vans were used to transport the passengers to the hospital. Fortunately, 2 drivers who were former paramedics provided immediate first aid to the injured right on the runway. Meanwhile, the airport mechanics and office staff took the vans to the hospital, which was located 3 miles away. Despite the chaotic and stressful circumstances, only 8 people suffered severe injuries, but they all later made a full recovery. The plane was in really bad shape though, and it was no wonder it couldn't handle the stress of the decompression incident. Despite its age not being a problem, it had experienced a whole lot of takeoffs and landings, which took a toll on its integrity. The salty and humid environment it operated in only added to the damage. You see, planes are designed to withstand a certain number of flight cycles, and this plane had exceeded that number by a long shot. The majority of its flights were short domestic ones, which meant it had to take off and land way more times than it was designed for. This is what ultimately led to the roof coming off during the flight. The poor condition of the plane meant that it was beyond repair and had to be dismantled right there at the airport. What's interesting is that in an interview after the accident, one passenger recalled that she had noticed a crack in the plane's fuselage while she was boarding. She didn't tell the flight crew about it because she didn't think it was worth it, so they didn't know to check it. It's important to remember that these types of accidents are very rare nowadays. Major airlines and airports take numerous steps to ensure safety. And according to Harvard University, the chances of being in an airplane accident are about 1 in 1.2 million. And that's a tiny percentage, and I don't know about you, but I find that very comforting. And even if something did happen, such as the roof of the plane coming off, it's reassuring to know that the pilots are trained to handle emergencies and can still land the plane safely.
Sweat was dripping down the man's forehead. He turned his face towards his family, his wife and 2 teenage daughters, and all he asked them was to hope for the best. Doug White and his family were enjoying a pleasant ascent through the clouds after a smooth takeoff. It wasn't a commercial flight, more of a private one. White owns the King Air and leases it through his company, White Equipment Leasing LLC, based in Archibald, Louisiana. They were in the comfort of their own plane. What could go wrong? Suddenly, the pilot of their twin-engine aircraft, Joe Kabuk, leaned back and emitted a deep noise. The retired jet pilot then lost consciousness, and soon after, he passed away. Although Doug held a pilot's license, he had no experience flying a plane of this size. With his hands cold and shivering from fear, he realized he was not going to give up. He and his family would carry on living. He knew he had the expertise he needed to save them all. But there were several problems. First, all his experience was in a single-engine Cessna 172. Unfortunately, Doug lacked experience with the larger, faster King Air. Second, the last time he flew was 18 years ago. And number 3, there was no autopilot. I mean, sure, there was one, but White mentioned that he attempted to reactivate the autopilot, but it directed the aircraft northward, following the route that Kabuk had set for the flight to Jackson, Mississippi. It was high time to start acting. White asked his wife to help him get the pilot out of his seat. worried that he might collapse and accidentally press some of the control buttons. Alas, the cramped space made it impossible for them to pull the man out, so they secured him back into the seat with the straps. Although White understood that they were meant to halt their ascent at 10,000 feet, he observed them climbing well beyond that altitude. But in the Cessna, he had never reached an altitude higher than 7,000 feet. Now, it all depended on the precise and timely instructions from the air traffic controllers he managed to connect with. Luckily, he knew exactly how to use the radio.
I need a King Air pilot to talk to.
One of the air traffic controllers contacted a friend in Connecticut who was certified to operate the King Air. The pilot consulted flight checklists, manuals, and cockpit diagrams to offer guidance to the controller, who then communicated the necessary steps to White, who was thousands of feet above the ground. Due to the faulty autopilot setting, Doug had to fly the plane manually. He managed the descent and ultimately landed safely in Fort Myers shortly after 2 p.m. Doug's story proves that if you really want to do something, you will nail it. You can land a plane even if you have no idea how to do that, or even if you're blind. No jokes here. History knows someone who did land a plane being blind. Jim O'Neill was piloting a Cessna, the type of plane Doug knew how to fly, by the way, from Scotland to southeastern England. The flight had been proceeding smoothly, with the aircraft functioning perfectly, until, without warning, everything took a dire turn about 40 minutes into his solo flight. O'Neill wasn't particularly young. He was 65, and, as it happens to some of us when we get old, he experienced a stroke. It's a terrible experience even if you're somewhere in the city with hospitals nearby. But Jim had it while piloting at an altitude of 5,500 feet. Strokes hardly ever come unnoticed, and consequences can be dreadful. Jim got completely blind because of that stroke. Initially, he thought the blinding sunlight had obscured his vision, but when it didn't clear, he realized he was in serious danger, alone at the controls of the plane. He couldn't even see the dials. In a panic, O'Neill managed to locate the radio and communicated his emergency to ground control. His distress call was received by RAF Wing Commander Paul Gerard, who had just completed a training flight in the vicinity. Gerard took to the skies to assist O'Neill, guiding him as he flew alongside the incapacitated pilot. Gerard led O'Neill to the nearest airstrip, which introduced another challenge: how to ensure a safe landing. On his first attempt, O'Neill touched down but then bounced back into the air. The second attempt had the same outcome. However, on his third try, guided by Gerard's instructions, he executed a nearly flawless landing. Landing an aircraft completely blind requires someone right there to guide you. Left a bit, right a bit, stop, down. During the critical final approach, even with radar, visual confirmation is essential. That's why having another pilot was invaluable. After the landing, O'Neill was transported to the hospital, where his vision gradually started to return. Yeah, you never know what might happen to the pilot. That's exactly the reason why two pilots are mandatory at almost all times. It significantly enhances safety in the event of a technical failure, health concern, or let's say, if one of the pilots is pulled out of the plane. On June 10, 1990, passengers boarding British Airways Flight 5390 from Birmingham to Malaga had no idea of the horrifying experience that awaited them. In a dramatic incident, the pilot was partially ejected from the aircraft after a window blew out during the flight, leaving him clinging to the window frame for 20 nerve-wracking minutes. Sudden decompression can be life-threatening, but against all odds, Captain Timothy Lancaster survived the ordeal. British Airways Flight 5390 was a popular service for British holidaymakers traveling to Malaga. On that day, the BAC 111-500 aircraft took off with 81 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The aircraft had a long history, having been in service since 1971 and previously flown by various airlines before joining British Airways in 1988. Captain Timothy Lancaster, aged 42, the first officer Alistair Atchison, 39, were at the controls. With thousands of flight hours between them, they were well prepared for the routine flight. Shortly after takeoff, while the plane was climbing to 17,300 feet, the left windscreen detached with a loud bang, causing rapid decompression. Lancaster was thrust headfirst out of the plane, held only by his legs caught on the controls. As the aircraft started to descend quickly, cabin crew member Nigel Ogden rushed to assist, realizing the severity of the situation. Atchison managed the autopilot while maintaining communication, which was difficult due to the noise and chaos inside the cockpit. The crew had to physically hold on to Lancaster to prevent him from being pulled into the engines. Atchison expertly regained control and communicated with air traffic control to prepare for an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. After 35 minutes in the air, Flight 5390 landed safely. Despite sustaining severe injuries, including frostbite and fractures, both Lancaster and Ogden survived. Fortunately, no other injuries were reported. An investigation revealed that the windscreen bolts were incorrectly installed due to maintenance errors, causing the decompression. The maintenance manager responsible was criticized for failing to follow the procedures. Another crazy story about landing in the most incredible circumstances is this story about a woman from Spain. Sadly, it doesn't have an entirely happy ending. She and her husband, who was the designated pilot, were on a plane. The ultralight aircraft took off from Trebujena and was to land at Coria del Rio, a small town near Seville. There were no signs of trouble when suddenly the man lost consciousness. His wife had no idea how to fly, yet, luckily, she managed to get in touch with air traffic controllers who guided her through the landing process for approximately 90 minutes before her emergency landing attempt on Sunday. It all ended up in an ultralight crash, and the woman survived it, though she got several burns and bruises. Her husband, unfortunately, tragically lost his life.
This could have been one of the biggest disasters in aviation history. It was close to midnight at San Francisco International Airport when Air Canada Flight 759 approached for landing. The pilots were almost done for that day and thought they'd land as usual, but they were unaware that the airport looked different that night. Runway 28 right was open, while runway 28 left, usually parallel, was closed for maintenance, with its lights turned off. Despite having landed here before, the pilots made a critical error. Expecting to see two parallel runways, they mistook the center runway for the darkened 28 left and assumed the taxiway on the right was 28 right. What the crew didn't realize was that the taxiway wasn't empty. 4 planes were lined up there, waiting for takeoff, with more than 1,000 passengers in total, and their plane was headed straight toward them. There was a notice to airmen, which listed important details for flights, including this critical information. But these notices are long and dense, often stretching several pages, and the closure detail had been missed by the Air Canada crew. That night, the pilots were conducting a visual approach, relying on what they could see to align with the runway. This is normal in good weather, but is much harder at night. The crew had flown from Toronto and were tired after a long day. Their internal clocks were already past 3 a.m., and Canadian rules regarding pilot rest were less strict than those in the U.S. The captain had been working for nearly 19 hours without proper rest. As the plane got closer to danger, no one in the cockpit noticed they were on the wrong path. Planes approaching San Francisco often come in at a slight angle to reduce noise over the bay. It's normal for them to appear slightly off to air traffic controllers. But this added to the confusion, and the Air Canada crew kept heading toward the taxiway. When the pilots finally realized that something was off, they radioed the control tower to confirm their landing clearance. The controller, who was managing both air traffic and ground operations due to the late hour, took several seconds to respond. He cleared them to land, unaware that the plane was lined up for the wrong path. Meanwhile, the crew of one of the planes on the runway quickly radioed the tower, alerting them to the imminent danger. The tower immediately instructed the Air Canada crew to stop and go around for another attempt. The Air Canada pilots pulled up just in time, missing the parked planes by just a couple feet. The pilots, still shaken from the near miss, saved hundreds of lives. After the incident, a full investigation was conducted. Now, there are new safety measures, but there are still concerns about whether the lessons learned are enough. Recent years have seen an alarming rise in such awful close calls. Qantas Flight 32, a scheduled flight from London to Sydney via Singapore, encountered a critical emergency on November 4, 2010. Just minutes after taking off from Singapore's Changi Airport, as an Airbus A380 was flying over the Riau Islands in Indonesia, it encountered a serious problem. One of its 4 engines underwent an uncontained failure. For the next 2 hours, the crew faced a tense and difficult situation as they tried to figure out how badly the plane was damaged. The accident happened at 10:01 a.m. Singapore time. When the engine went off, pieces of it flew into the wing, damaging important systems. The fuel system was hit, causing leaks and even starting a fire in one of the fuel tanks. It also took out one of the plane's hydraulic systems, which help control things like the flaps and landing gear. It disabled the anti-lock brakes, which are crucial for safe landings. 2 of the other engines started to lose power as well, and the flaps, which help control the plane's descent and speed, were damaged. Despite the harm to the aircraft, the crew realized it was still controllable. They decided to circle near Singapore for about 50 minutes while they carefully checked the condition of the aircraft. The first officer and the supervising captain then used a special landing calculator to see if they could land safely at Changi, even though the plane was 50 tons heavier than its maximum landing weight. At first, the system couldn't give them a landing distance, but after adjusting for the fact that the runway was dry, it showed they could land with only 328 feet of runway left to spare. At 11:45 a.m., the plane landed safely at Changi Airport, but because it was going about 40 miles per hour faster than usual, 4 of its tires blew out when it touched down. After landing, the crew ran into another problem. They couldn't shut off the number 1 engine. Emergency crews had to step in and put out the engine themselves. The crew had to decide whether to evacuate the plane right away because fuel was leaking near the overheated brakes, which could have caused a fire. Captain David Evans later explained that, despite the risk, it was actually safer to keep everyone on board until things settled down. The cabin crew stayed on high alert, ready to evacuate passengers immediately if the situation got worse. To make things even tougher, the plane was running on battery power, which meant they could only use 1 radio to communicate with emergency services. Luckily, the danger passed, and everyone was able to leave the plane calmly using a set of stairs. Everyone on board, 440 passengers and 29 crew members, got out safely. On the ground in Batam, some debris from the engine fell on a school, houses, and a car, but thankfully, everyone was okay there as well. Just a few missteps could have made that situation turn out very differently, but luckily the crew handled it like heroes. Investigators eventually found that the problem started because a small oil pipe in the engine had been poorly made, leading to the disaster. This was the first time an engine failure like this had happened on an A380. It was, and still is, the world's largest passenger plane at the time. As a result, Qantas and some other airlines temporarily grounded all of its A380 planes to ensure they were safe. Another similar incident happened with Northwest Airlines Flight 85 in 2002. The plane took off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. There were 4 pilots on board. About 7 hours into the flight, flying at 35,000 feet, an unexpected issue struck. The plane veered sharply, banking to the left. The pilots initially thought an engine had failed. The senior captain quickly returned to the cockpit and took manual control. An emergency was declared, and they decided to divert the flight to Anchorage. It was hard to communicate, as they were in a zone with weak signals. Eventually, they connected with another Northwest Airlines flight nearby, which relayed their emergency call to Alaska. The situation was so unusual that none of the usual emergency procedures worked. The flight crew called Northwest Airlines headquarters in Minneapolis for help, but even they couldn't find a solution. Thankfully, the pilots worked together to control the plane. They managed to steer the plane using the ailerons, and by applying more power to one engine than the other. This tricky maneuver allowed them to land safely at Anchorage. After the incident, the NTSB and Boeing investigated once again. The NTSB investigator described it as a dramatic event that required careful examination. They found a crack in the power control module for the rudder, which had caused part of its metal housing to break. This break was unusual because it affected the module's outer casing, not just the inside parts. The NTSB concluded that the crack led to what's known as a rudder hardover, where the rudder is pushed to its maximum position and stays there, causing the sudden dangerous turn. All of these horrible situations show how fatigue, miscommunication, and outdated procedures can lead to disasters. But the sheer number of them in history, especially in U.S. airports, raises the question of whether enough lessons have truly been learned. The plane broke into 3 large pieces and crashed onto the hillside, scattering parts all over the snowy ground. The wings ripped off, and the main body of the aircraft split into 2 parts. Flames crackled from what was left of the airplane. 7 out of 9 crew members survived the crash. They were all part of the 1946 U.S. mission to map the Antarctic continent. There were 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 people to do the job. They only had 2 months of summer down there before the weather got too bad. USS Pine Island took 3 seaplanes on their mission. One of the planes, called George 1, had a crew of 9 people. They went on their first 10-hour mission. Later, when it was time for the second flight, the weather got worse, with stormy seas and low visibility. But they decided to take the chance and fly anyway. It was supposed to be an epic adventure, and even the captain of Pine Island joined the expedition. The pilot, Ralph Frenchy LeBlanc, was very experienced and not worried about the weather. The plane was tied to some small boats, but the waves were so strong that the lines holding it were damaging the plane's metal body. Crew members had to attach 4 special rocket boosters, called jet-assisted takeoff bottles, to help the plane lift off. It managed to do so after a run of about 5 miles, but got straight into a blinding snowstorm. James Robbie Robbins was just 19 years old back then, but already had 1,500 hours of experience as a radar operator in that type of seaplane. He once successfully flew 9 hours through thick fog and clouds in Greenland, so he trusted his abilities. The radar showed a mountain range 20 miles ahead and icebergs spread out, and it was all correct. They had to stay low to take photos for mapping, and it was impossible in bad weather. So the pilot decided to turn the plane around to head back to the ship. Suddenly, the plane hit something. At the time, they didn't know what it was, but later they realized it was a snow-covered ridge that was hidden and couldn't be seen on radar. The loud bang shocked everyone on board. The pilot and co-pilot quickly pushed the plane's controls to try to lift it back into the sky. But just a few seconds later, the fuel tank in the front of the plane blew up. Collapsing with a ridge likely cracked one of the fuel tanks, so the gas started to leak. The fumes from the gas might have been set on fire by an electrical spark or the plane's hot engines. The blast was so strong that it broke the plane into 3 parts. The pilot was hurt and stuck upside down in the burning front part of the aircraft. Some of the other men were also badly injured. Some crawled out of the wreckage, and others had been thrown out into the snow during the crash. Most of them couldn't even remember the bang or the impact. The crew managed to pull the trapped pilot out of the wreckage and put him into a sleeping bag inside the back part of the plane. They also tried to help Frederick Williams, who was severely injured. They placed him on a piece of debris to keep him still and wrapped him in blankets to keep him warm. Unfortunately, even though they did their best to take care of them, Williams passed away a few hours later. Sadly, the navigator and the radio man didn't survive the crash either. 3 crew members had only 1 blanket, so they took turns staying in the middle where it was warmer. For the first 3 days, the weather was really bad. It snowed a lot, and the sky was super dark and cloudy. The crew started looking through the wreckage for anything useful. Near what used to be the back part of the plane, they found 3 big boxes of pemmican. It's a kind of emergency food that has everything you need to stay healthy, but it's not the most delicious food on Earth. Each box had about 100 paper cups filled with this special food. They also found better food in the flight rations. There were steaks, potatoes, canned veggies, bread, butter, salt, pepper, sugar, canned milk, a few cookies, and even 2 big cans of peanut butter. They had enough food to last for a while, and they figured the pemmican would help them get through the long, dark winter if necessary. All of the fresh food was hidden in the snow, where the kitchen used to be, so they had to dig it out. They got most of the sugar by licking it off the snow and separating it by taste. The crew also found a small 2-burner stove in the emergency supplies, but they didn't have any fuel. Luckily, the plane had some fuel left in the tanks, so they tapped one of the lines and had enough to last a long time. They kept the burners constantly on to melt snow to fill 2 or 3 water holders that held about 4 or 5 gallons each. It seemed like it took 15 or 20 pots of snow to fill just 1 cup of water. After 3 days, the weather got better, the sky was clear, and the sun was shining brightly. From where they were, they could see the ocean down the hill. While exploring the wreckage, they found more sleeping bags, a camera with film, and other supplies like a sled and a life raft made for 9 people. Days went by, and the sun never went down. Huge, hungry seagulls hanging out right next to the wreck were getting on everyone's nerves. To distract themselves a bit, the crew played an old Navy game called Salvo. It's like a battleships game for 2 players, where your task is to find and defeat all the ships of your rival. They also took some photos of everyone and the wreck from different angles with a Brownie box camera they had on the plane. The radar man painted big yellow letters on the airplane's wings with the names of the deceased crew members to make sure rescuers knew what had happened. On the 13th day, a rescue plane finally showed up. Everyone shouted, waved, and did everything to get the pilot's attention, but the plane didn't stop and kept flying. 2 hours later, it came back, and Robbins, in a hurry, threw fuel onto a pile of flammable stuff to set it on fire. The bang was so big, it burned his eyebrows, but it worked. The plane turned and flew toward them, wiggling its wings as a sign it saw them. The pilot dropped a note attached to a weight. It said, "If you can walk to the lake, make a circle. If not, form a straight line." The lake was 10 miles away, but they knew they had no choice but to get there, and so they made a circle, signaling that they were ready for rescue. Then they got to work. They stacked sleeping bags on a sled and placed their injured pilot on top. Robbins took a compass from the crashed plane and attached it to the sled's handlebars to help guide them. 3 men pulled the sled while another walked behind, making sure they stayed on track. The snow was so deep that they often sank up to their waists. The journey only got easier when they reached solid ground. So it took them 24 hours to walk the 10 miles to the shore. As they got close, a thick fog rolled in, so they couldn't see the rescue plane. But the pilot started the engines, and the crew followed the sound. Soon, 2 rescuers arrived in a raft and helped them paddle out to the waiting plane. They climbed aboard and flew back to their ship, the Pine Island. All the survivors were taken to the USS Philippine Sea and later returned home. For 6 of the 9 men who crashed on Thurston Island, life continued.
Whoa! What's going on here?
Ah! 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 No!
Ah!
No!
I gotta get out of here! But where can I get a parachute? Ah! We're falling straight into the water! Oh, well, Okay, I'm alive. Good news, right?
Yeah, I'm okay too.
Who built this stupid plane?
And now let's get out of here.
This wing almost crushed my head.
Come on, let's get into the boat. No worries, I know how to use it.
Thank goodness we managed to evacuate.
Yeah.
What the heck was that?
Poor thing. Must have been hit by the aircraft.
I hope it's not what I think.
Can you hear that? I read about this weird low-frequency sound recorded by scientists in 1997.
What? What's it doing? No, it's moving here. Hurry up! Let's get out of here!
Watch your head! Ah!
No way! Hello? SOS! I need help!
I'm sorry, I can't hear you well. Repeat.
I'm trapped in a terrible storm!
You've disappeared from our radar, bro. We can't find you.
How is this possible? Hello? Radio check! Oh, I hope I'm not in the Bermuda Triangle. Whoa, this ship is my hope for salvation. I guess. I'd rather hide from the storm than here. Whoa, this is so luxurious. Hey, is anyone here? Phew, that was scary. This place is so weird. Oh, it's just a draft. Wow, this ship is more decrepit than I thought. Good monster, don't eat me. I'm not tasty. What the heck? Oh, why do I always get into trouble? Phew, this place seems safe. Oh, that was close. No! What? Oh, where am I? Phew, it was just a dream. I'm safe.
Virtual training simulation is activated, initiating shark attack protocol. This course was designed to improve your survival chances in a shark attack. Remember, this is a simulation. No matter what happens, you are safe. This may seem relaxing, but things are about to get intense. That doesn't sound so good. I hope you can swim. There are over 500 species of sharks, but only around 12 of those species have been known to attack humans. Statistically, the chances of a shark attack are low. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than become fish food. But just in case it does happen, there are a few things to remember. Sharks are opportunistic predators. They prey on wounded or defenseless animals. They are attracted to movement, so try not to panic or draw attention to yourself by splashing. That's better. You should try and get towards the shore quietly and quickly. Remember, you can't outswim a shark, so you might need to fight it off. There are signs that indicate that a shark is about to attack. These include circling, sharp turns, and the lowering of the dorsal fin. That attack looks imminent, so it's time to take action. Never play dead. The shark will think you're an easy meal. Always face towards the shark. You'll want to see what it's doing. You may have heard that punching a shark on the nose will stop it. It might work as a last resort, but it'll probably make a shark angrier. Instead, try putting something between you and the shark. That's a good idea. I hope you're feeling brave. Remember, this is just a simulation. Try aiming for the eyes or gills. Hitting these sensitive spots may startle the shark. You did it. Now let's get out of the water. Keep going. You're almost there. Congratulations. You survived a shark attack. This training session is over.
This is Captain. Report the latest information.
I'm on a deck. All is well, sir. Whoa! Have you seen that fin? It's huge! I thought Megalodon was a silly myth.
There shouldn't be any sharks here, especially fantastic ones.
But I saw something, that's for sure. I guess it just swam away.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, Cap, why did you stop? What's going on?
The ship propellers are damaged. We need to evacuate now.
Captain, I can't hear you. Please repeat.
Run to the boats. Move it.
Oh my God! Just look at those teeth. Unbelievable.
Whoa, I wish my teeth were just as strong.
Ah! Oil tanks! They're exploding! We need to get out of here quickly!
Hey, where are you? I'm already in the boat. Come here.
Gotcha! I'm running to the boats!
Hurry up, buddy.
I'm close! I'll be there in a second! Whoa! If I survive all these obstacles, of course! Whoa! I did it!
Lucky you. Let's get out of here.
Whoa! Take it easy, we can get a concussion! Captain, I think we're going down!
Oh, don't be so pessimistic. Congratulations, we're safe, buddy.
What about the shark?
I guess the fire scared it away.
Or maybe it just likes hitting large ships only.
Check. I'm ready to dive.
Read you loud and clear.
Okay, let's begin the expedition.
Let me remind you that we're exploring one of the most mysterious places on the planet. Weird stuff happens here all the time. So be careful and don't play the hero.
Don't worry about me. Let's go. Phew, it's getting so dark and sad here. Are you sure the pressure won't crush me?
The world record for deep diving is 1,043 feet, and you've dived only 350. Besides, you're in a super strong pressure-resistant capsule, so there's no reason to worry.
Oh, I see aircraft wreckage. Is that a famous cargo flight?
Yep, no single person was hurt then, but the plane itself was badly damaged. These wrecks have been lying here abandoned for 30 years.
Wow, I saw a strange movement over there. Phew, I hope it's just my imagination. What if it's a kraken?
Do you still believe in fairy tales about that giant squid? Grow up, bro.
But there were so many eyewitness stories in the 19th century.
Yeah, mostly from fantasy authors.
No, I definitely saw something. Bro, check out those tentacles. It can't be an ordinary squid. This creature is at least 100 feet long.
Yeah, that is creepy. Get out of there, quickly.
No, I have to get it on camera. This is gonna be a sensation. We'll become super rich. Oh, I feel so tiny. Now I begin to understand who's responsible for all the weird things that happen around here. Just look at all these shipwrecks. Oh, hi, Body. Ah!
Radio show.
I'm here! It's a huge shark! It's trying to eat me alive! Get me out of here!
Emergency evacuation protocol just got launched.
Phew! Bye-bye, Kraken. See you in my nightmares.
It only takes a moment for a routine flight to turn into a gripping survival story. In a world where a wrong button or an unexpected gust of wind can lead to a disaster, adhering to safety rules is crucial for everyone. From buckling seatbelts to raising window shades during landing. We got all these rules learning from our mistakes. Stay tuned to find out more. A flight had a crazy mid-air moment in 1993 when the pilot accidentally deployed the wing slats, the part on the leading edge of the wing. Now, the weather was fine, passengers were relaxed, everyone was doing what they wanted. Suddenly, they felt an unexpected jolt. Instantly, the autopilot disengaged. The captain started wrestling with the controls. The plane became wonky, pitching and rolling dramatically, resulting in a rapid descent of 5,000 feet. The vibration threw the cabin into total chaos, with passengers screaming in fear. The slats were only to be used during takeoffs and landings, not in midair. It was China Eastern Airlines Flight 583, cruising over the Pacific on its way from Shanghai to Los Angeles. The pilot declared an emergency and directed the plane to an Air Force base in Alaska. Out of the 255 people on board, 60 ended up in a hospital, and sadly, 2 didn't make it. The pilot made some quick moves to stabilize the aircraft, but the injuries happened because folks weren't buckled in. They reckoned that the slats deployed because of the design of the control handle. The company was to blame for that. They produced it in such a way that the handle could accidentally get jiggled while cruising. Luckily, the crew was trained, and the airliner itself was fine, except for the messed-up cabin. The aftermath of this incident was costly, requiring about $1.5 million to repair the damage. When the plane started to lose altitude, overhead lockers burst open, and the safety video played 3 times for an eerie touch. Once the aircraft steadied, flight attendants jumped into action, providing first aid, leaving empty kits scattered in the cabin. It turned out that the poorly designed slat control handle had caused 11 similar incidents before. The captain probably nudged it accidentally while fixing the speed controls. The lack of pilot training on high-altitude issues and the stall warning system made things worse. If the passengers had kept their seatbelts on, injuries would have been way less severe. This has been the case during many other accidents. You probably know this airplane announcement. Even when the seatbelt sign is off, buckle up when you're seated. Experts say it's a good call. While flying is safe, keeping that seatbelt on is smart because you might hit unexpected turbulence. It's about keeping you secure during that bumpy, jarring time, especially that sneaky one during stormy weather. Sarah Wilson, the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, thinks the seatbelt sign should be turned on throughout the entire journey. Predicting turbulence is like trying to guess the weather. It's not 100% accurate. Turbulence can happen anywhere. Aircraft are tough. They can handle really bad turbulence. The real risk is getting injured during turbulence, not planes falling apart. It's rare, but accidents still happen. In a dramatic episode in 2016, a pilot pulled off a superhero move, saving 439 lives. He was getting ready for takeoff in Shanghai. All of a sudden, another plane showed up on the runway in front of him. Reacting with lightning-fast speed, the pilot swiftly elevated his plane, narrowly avoiding a disaster. The pilot was awarded $360,000 for his remarkable skills. He missed the other plane by less than 67 feet, about the length of a semi-trailer truck. It turned out that the air traffic controllers and the landing crew had mixed things up. 2 controllers lost their licenses, and 13 others got in trouble. They say this incident was like a throwback to the Tenerife airport collision in 1977. Back then, 2 jumbo aircraft collided on a foggy runway. They didn't get lucky that time. The incident was a total disaster. Certain accidents in aviation history prevented others. With each crash, something crucial is upgraded. In 1956, 2 planes collided over the Grand Canyon, resulting in the tragic loss of 128 lives on board. This accident kick-started a $250 million air traffic control system enhancement. The Federal Aviation Agency also appeared in 1958 to keep an eye on air safety. Then, in 1986, a private plane accidentally entered the Los Angeles control area, colliding with another aircraft. This tragedy took 86 people's lives. In response, collision avoidance systems were introduced. In 1978, United Flight 173 faced a landing gear problem. This led to a crash that claimed 10 lives. This incident triggered a transformation in cockpit training, introducing cockpit resource management. This management method shifted away from the traditional captain-centric approach to emphasizing teamwork and communication among the crew. Another upgrade was about averting in-flight emergencies. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 797 had smoke in the rear lavatory, which led to an accident that took 23 lives. The FAA responded by requiring smoke detectors and automatic fire extinguishers in aircraft lavatories. Post-1998, planes got retrofitted with fire-blocking seat cushions and floor lighting, with newer ones adopting flame-resistant materials. Winds can be dangerous in certain circumstances. The crash of Delta Flight 191 in 1985 brought attention to the dangers of wind shear. Research efforts by NASA and the FAA led to the development of forward-looking radar wind shear detectors. By the mid-90s, these became standard on airliners. The number of wind shear-related accidents has reduced significantly since then. In 1985, United Airlines Flight 232 faced a nightmare when the DC-10's engine failure left it virtually uncontrollable. Pilot Alfred Haynes landed the plane at a nearby airport, but the subsequent fire was terrifying. 185 passengers survived the catastrophe. The root cause of the incident was a crack in the fan disc, which occurred during the manufacturing of the titanium alloy. This incident prompted the FAA to modify the hydraulic system, implement redundant safety systems in future aircraft, and revolutionize engine inspection protocols. In 1988, a big chunk of an Aloha flight's fuselage ripped off in mid-flight. In an instant, the cabin was torn open, leaving the passengers exposed to the open sky. Despite the chaos, the pilots managed a safe landing, with only one fatality. The NTSB found that corrosion and fatigue damage, which had accumulated over 89,000 flight cycles, had caused this accident. The plane had been used for short-hop pressurized flights between the Hawaiian Islands. Shortly after, the agency initiated the National Aging Aircraft Research Program in 1991. This program tightened inspection and maintenance standards, especially for high-use and high-cycle planes. About 80% of mishaps happen in the first 3 minutes after takeoff or the last 8 minutes before landing. Keep your eyes peeled during these times, and your survival chances will go up. Now, don't let that freak you out. The odds of actually getting into a plane crash are like 1 in 11 million. That's the same possibility as being struck by lightning in a given year in the United States. Planes, on the other hand, often get struck by lightning, but they're built to handle it. Each plane probably gets zapped about once every year or every 3,000 hours it's up in the sky. But there hasn't been a lightning-related accident since 1967. Engineers have ensured that when a plane gets hit, the lightning just zips right through it and out without really messing up anything inside. Let's delve into the fascinating mechanics of how planes stay airborne. The wings are important, but it's not just about them. There are 4 forces at play: lift, thrust, drag, and weight. The little tails on the ends of wings are called winglets, and they help reduce air swirls, making the aircraft slicker and faster. There's a reason why lights dim when a plane lands at night. It prepares everyone for a quick evacuation, helping the eyes adjust to the dark should the landing go awry. You're in a bright room filled with obstacles, and suddenly the lights go out and you're asked to dash for the exit. Tricky. Flight attendants also ask you to raise those window shades during landing. In case of an emergency, they want you to be able to see what's outside and figure out if one side of the plane is better for a quick escape. If you're wondering where the safest spot in an airliner is, it's in the back. According to research conducted by Popular Mechanics, spanning from 1971 to 2005, sitting in the back gives you a 40% better shot at making it through an accident. Almost as importantly, you're closer to the restrooms. The airplane involved was a Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine aircraft. On board, pilot Bruce Gurnon had 2 passengers, his father and business partner. They took off from Andros Island in the Bahamas and headed northwest for the Florida coast. It was December 4, 1970. If you draw up a map, trace a line connecting the island of Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Miami, and back to Bermuda, what do you get? Yes, it's a triangle, a sinister polygon known for mysteriously swallowing over 2,000 ships and 200 aircraft over the centuries. Bruce Gurnon's plane was within its hungry grasp. But this was a typical flight Bruce had made dozens of times before. The trip usually took about an hour and a half, with no hiccups or mysterious phenomena whatsoever. The men were no more concerned than you would be during your daily commute to work. Oh, but this time would be different. They would face very unusual circumstances indeed. Bruce took off and started gaining altitude. Strange things started happening right from the get-go. At an altitude of about 1,000 feet, he noticed a small cloud up ahead. But it kept growing. Not from the plane getting closer, this thing was actually getting bigger in size. Bruce had to fly through it, and he came out the other end just fine. Another mysterious cloud appeared at 11,500 feet. This one was massive, and Bruce had no other choice but to fly through it too. So he concentrated, took a deep breath, and in they went. At that moment, it got dark as night all around the aircraft. Not a single sliver of sunshine got through. But this wasn't a storm cloud, and it wasn't raining. Bruce was starting to get worried, and then, bam! He saw flashes of white light. They would appear and vanish quickly like lightning. But this pilot knew this certainly was no lightning. The flashes were so bright, they lit up the whole space around them. Bruce kept flying for another 30 minutes when he realized this was the same cloud he had gone through earlier when he started to climb. But now the cloud was cylindrical, and the plane was flying through its center. It was about 1 mile wide and seemed endless. Bruce thought he could never get out of that trap. But a minute later, he saw light at the end of the tunnel. He kept that yoke straight ahead. He was almost out of this nightmare. But all of a sudden, unexplainable things started happening again. The walls of the cloud tunnel began to narrow. They were closing in on the plane. The navigational instruments started wigging out. The compass was spinning by itself counterclockwise. The electronic instruments were all malfunctioning. It was like the plane was being operated by something else, or it was moving inside some kind of current. All of Bruce's attempts to take control were to no avail. He kept flying through that tunnel, bound and determined to get out of this thing and live to tell the tale. The walls kept narrowing, smaller and smaller, wrapping like a vortex. Bruce was running out of time. He had to get out of this place fast. The next 20 seconds were the most intense of his life. But then, he burst out of this foggy trap. As Bruce described later, he felt weightless for 5 seconds as his plane left the tunnel. The clouds dispersed, and now the aircraft was in a grayish haze. The men let out a big sigh of relief. He immediately grabbed the radio and contacted ground control. Bruce wanted them to determine his location. But when the dispatcher looked at the green screen, his face became contorted with confusion. Bruce's plane wasn't on the radar. It was as if the thing was invisible. But then the dispatcher said the aircraft was already in Miami airspace. Bruce was utterly shocked by this information. It just couldn't be true. The distance the Beechcraft was supposed to cover was about 250 miles. Remember, the whole trip usually took around 90 minutes. But this time, it took just 47 minutes to get to the destination. This model of aircraft can only cruise at about 180 miles per hour. Do the math, and anyone would understand that this was physically impossible. The dispatcher must have made a mistake. But when the clouds parted, Bruce saw that he really was over Miami. The plane landed safely, and it was time to try and solve this mystery. So what happened on that flight? Bruce checked the remaining fuel and his watch. After a short calculation, he was only more confused. The plane hadn't gone through the amount of fuel it should have. Bruce couldn't have been wrong. He was a very experienced pilot. By his early 20s, he already had 600 hours of flight under his belt, and he was all too familiar with this airspace he'd flown countless times. All the evidence in hand seemed to indicate that Bruce's plane just skipped over almost half the entire distance. The man thought about this bizarre occurrence for a long time. He even consulted with professors and experts, but none of them could give an exact answer to what happened that day. So he came up with his own theory and even wrote a book about it. Bruce thought it all came down to this electric fog with white flashes. Others, however, theorized that dark energy was responsible for this time leap. Yes, that same dark energy responsible for the expansion of the universe. This energy could have curved time-space like a black hole, forming this strange tunnel. Bruce accidentally hit it, but he was lucky to get out of there. That's how he got into Miami airspace so fast. But dark energy is just a theory attempting to explain the unexplainable. To this day, there is no real answer for how Bruce was able to travel that distance in such a short time. But some details still can be explained. Archive records show that 84 sunspots were recorded that day, as well as a huge solar wind moving almost 440 miles per second. This would cause disturbances in the Earth's magnetosphere that could throw off the plane's instruments and radars. So Bruce's version that he was in an electronic fog could be right. And about these weird clouds. The thing is, they're pretty commonplace things in this area. Zones with low and high pressure are constantly colliding there. The result, storm clouds. Perhaps that cloud growing before Bruce's eyes was simply two massive air currents crashing into each other. But so far, no one has been able to explain how the plane got to Miami so fast. Well, maybe in the future the truth will be revealed. In the meantime, it remains another mysterious riddle of the Bermuda Triangle. But it's still by far not the most shocking incident there. In 1945, a total of 5 planes went missing in the Bermuda Triangle all at once. On December 5th, some Navy student pilots were training in the area. The day's lesson? Navigation. Ironically enough, they couldn't find their way back to the base and got lost. Many people assume they ran out of fuel. This is likely to have caused the incident, but the circumstances were very strange. The students were under the supervision of an experienced lieutenant who had 2,500 flight hours. He would never let a bunch of newbies go so far that they'd get lost. The incident was called Flight 19. Even now, there's a debate about how it could have happened. 3 years later, a passenger jet headed to Miami from Puerto Rico disappeared in the same area. There were 29 passengers and 3 crew members on board. The weather was clear throughout the flight. But experts believe that when the plane was about 50 miles off the coast of Miami, it could have been hit by a strong wind that knocked it off course. Years later, divers found a similar-looking plane in the waters. But since it was lacking certain details and registrations, no one could confirm that it was the missing Miami-bound aircraft. The next month, in January 1948, another plane went missing in Bermuda. 25 passengers and 6 crew members just vanished somewhere between Azores and Bermuda. The mystery of this plane's disappearance, along with countless others, remains unsolved. It was Friday, February 19, 1937. A Stinson airplane was traveling from Brisbane's Archfield Aerodrome to Sydney. There were 7 people on board, 5 passengers and 2 pilots. Along the way, the plane was meant to pick up some passengers in Lismore, but it never arrived. The official search centered around Newcastle and the Hawkesbury River, hundreds of miles south, where some people said they saw or heard the plane. The authorities took a statement from the postmaster in Hawkesbury. He said he'd heard the plane pass overhead just after 5 in the evening on the day it disappeared. Since he knew a lot about the aircraft, the authorities were convinced by his statement. But others believed something else. People who lived in the McPherson Ranges, on the border between Queensland and New South Wales, heard the aircraft going overhead at the same time it always did. People in the area knew about the flight from Brisbane. Some of them saw the blue and red Stinson plane vanishing into the clouds. After days of searching, nothing was found. At this point, a bushman called Bernard O'Reilly decided to take matter into his own hands. He lived in that high area of the country and remembered that there had been a powerful storm on the night of the disappearance. A big cyclone going over the mountains had made it impossible for the locals to do any work. On Saturday, February 27th, O'Reilly decided to go and find the missing aircraft and find out what had happened. The day before, he had gathered all the evidence on where the plane could be. O'Reilly got his ruler out and drew a line across a map to the last known place where the plane had been heard. He saw that the line crossed 4 high points. He was sure that the aircraft had never got beyond the nearby mountain range. He packed some food, climbed onto his horse, and set out. He rode to Mount Bithingable, then set his horse home. He continued on foot through the dense rainforest. He could barely see. The vines in the forest were as thick as wire netting. There wasn't much light that day, and he struggled to get his bearings. O'Reilly searched for clues to understand where he was. He looked for patterns in tree growth and differences in the level of bloom among the plant species. He tried to spot different birds' nests, which would indicate his altitude. He spent Saturday night in the wet forest and continued his search the next day. From the top of Mount Throckban, through a brief opening in the clouds, O'Reilly saw some high rocks. He suspected the Stinson aircraft had crashed there. Far to the southwest, in the endless green forest, he spotted a light brown treetop. This was an unnatural color for the late summer and seemed out of place. Fires happen rarely in the rainforest, but lightning strikes were possible. Could it just be a coincidence? Judging by his map, the tree was 8 miles away. O'Reilly pushed through the forest to reach it. When he was 3 miles away from the spot, he heard 2 voices calling out cooeys. This is a shout-out used by the Australian bush to attract attention, find missing people, or indicate someone's location. He thought it could be other search teams, and answering would have confused them. So he kept silent and continued walking toward the location of the voices. He crossed a gorge and climbed up high. He called out to see if anyone was there, but still got no reply. He walked back 600 feet along the plateau and shouted again. That was when he heard a response and headed toward it. O'Reilly finally arrived and saw a big tree which had been cut down. The entire trunk of another tree was burned, and there was a mass of metal on the ground. Finally, he saw 2 men. The other 4 hadn't made it. The 2 he found were the passengers Joseph Binstead and James Proud. But as soon as he saw them, he couldn't talk. Judging by their condition, O'Reilly knew he had possibly arrived too late to save the 2 men. It was 4 p.m. on Sunday. By that time, the 2 men had been alone in the forest for 9 days. Proud couldn't move because he had injured his leg, and Binstead had been carrying water for both of them. They had only found berries to eat and had lost all hope until O'Reilly appeared. There wasn't much daylight left, and O'Reilly decided to head back using a different, shorter route to get help. He came across someone on the way. O'Reilly told them what had happened and asked to borrow their horse. He later used a utility truck to reach someone's farm and call for help. On the farm, he found the number of a Mr. Robinson from Airlines of Australia using the Brisbane phone directory. O'Reilly called him and explained things and asked if he could organize a rescue party for the 2 survivors. Robinson agreed. O'Reilly and the farmer put together 2 separate groups. The first party, led by O'Reilly, would go back to the site with a small team, including a doctor and some supplies. They gathered at 2:30 a.m. on Monday, left an hour before the sun came up, and arrived at the site by 11 in the morning. The group led by Mr. Buchanan, the farmer, included more than 100 people. They started work at dawn, clearing the path that led to the plateau where the 2 survivors were. The plan was to carry them down the track to safety. Both Binstead and Proud would have to spend one more night in the forest, but this time they would get a tent and medical care. When the sun rose on Tuesday morning, March 2nd, the journey down the plateau started. The group cleared a 14-mile path, and the survivors' condition was stabilized. 6 of the 7 passengers had now been found, except for one. His name was Jim Westray, and he had helped the others get off the plane before it caught fire during the accident. That fire had lasted 15 minutes, but it was put out by heavy rain, which continued until 10 the next morning. On Saturday, at 6:30 a.m., before the rain stopped, Westray stood up and said he could see a farm with some sheep in the distance. The other 2 guys tried to discourage him from going and told him there was nothing out there. Westray said he would go there to get help, and within 30 seconds he was gone. When O'Reilly arrived, he was asked by the 2 survivors if he had seen Westray, but O'Reilly was sure he hadn't made it. He followed Westray's path to a 40-foot-high waterfall and confirmed his theory that he hadn't survived. The operation was successful, and the 2 survivors made it. The story made national headlines, and there were broadcasts about it on TV. O'Reilly was presented with a plaque and a check raised from the public. Years later, O'Reilly's nephew, Peter, organized tours showing his uncle's journey to the site.
Do you know the feeling when you've been trying to solve one mystery for your entire life? Nope? Well, Detective Anderson does. During almost 30 years of working for the police, he solved many riddles, caught hundreds of robbers, and helped save thousands of lives. There's a huge number of successfully solved cases on his record. At the age of 25, he caught a thief who changed his own face with plastic surgery once a year. When Anderson was 30, prisoners started breaking from jails all over the world. The detective successfully solved this case. At the age of 38, he discovered the secret base of a forbidden order in a volcano's mouth. By his 50s, he managed to explain all the most inexplicable things in the world. But there was something he couldn't solve. These were 2 mysteries from the 50s, cases of missing planes. All these years, Anderson has been scrolling through the details of this puzzle. Unfortunately, he was too young when this story began. All he had were guesses and notes. But today, a sudden thought struck him. For the first time in many years, he felt that he could finally solve this mystery. But to do this, he had to immerse himself in this story again. So he opened the closet and pulled out 2 old magazines with detailed articles about these incidents. The first one happened in the summer of 1955. July 1st, Pan Am Flight 914 was about to depart from New York Airport with 61 people on board. The plane model was a Douglas DC-4. It differed from modern aircraft, having giant propellers instead of turbines. So, all passengers fastened their seatbelts. The plane started taxiing down the runway, sped up, and took off. It went high into the sky and out of sight. Its destination was Florida. The flight time would be 3 hours. Dispatching services were watching the plane on their radar when suddenly, Pan Am 914 disappeared. The operator tried to contact the pilot but received no response. New York reported this to Florida. They said they couldn't see the plane either. Usually, pilots notify via radio if a plane crashes or gets into a storm. But this time, just nothing. After several unsuccessful attempts to establish the connection, they deployed large-scale search operations. Communication with the plane was interrupted when it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, the air company had to admit the aircraft crashed into the water. But this version had no proof. When planes fall that way, rescuers find floating debris. Some parts of the cabin or luggage always get to the surface. This time, rescuers found nothing. The plane didn't transmit any distress signals and didn't leave any traces of the crash. It seemed like it just disappeared into thin air. People forgot about this disaster for 37 years. And then, something bizarre happened. 1992, Venezuela, Caracas Airport. The control tower received a signal about an unknown aircraft approaching them. It was weird because it wasn't supposed to be there. There were no flights scheduled for that time. The plane was landing. The dispatcher and the rest of the airport staff understood that something was wrong here. The plane looked old, with huge propellers instead of turbines. After landing, the pilot contacted the airport.
Where are we?
The dispatcher asked him to identify himself. A few seconds later, he received an answer.
We are Pan Am Flight 914, departed from New York to Florida, with a crew of 4 people and 57 passengers on board.
The dispatcher didn't know what to do next. He and the airport staff understood what kind of plane they were looking at. What was this plane doing 37 years later, and almost 1,240 miles away from its destination? After a few seconds, the startled dispatcher turned on the microphone and said,
It is September 9th, 1992. You know that?
A long pause followed. Then, the pilot responded in a panic.
Oh no. Jimmy, where are we? No! Stay away! Let's go now!
The airport staff saw the pilot waving his hands in horror through the glass. Then, he started the engines and took the plane to the runway. Pan Am 914 increased its speed and took off. The dispatcher tried to stop him, but the pilot didn't respond. The plane disappeared into the sky, and no one else had heard of it since that day. Detective Anderson finished reading the article. He frowned and looked out the window. Raindrops were hitting the glass. The storm outside perfectly depicted what was happening in his mind at that moment. He seemed to know what had happened to that plane. All the clues were there, lying right in front of his eyes. But to know for sure, Anderson had to move on to the next case. It was another article, dated 1989. It happened in 1954. Santiago Airlines Flight 513 took off from West Germany Airport. The plane was due to land in Brazil in 18 hours. There were 88 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane hid behind the clouds and disappeared from all radar. Air traffic controllers were trying to contact the pilots, but didn't receive a response. 18 hours later, they called the airport in Brazil. Those dispatchers couldn't confirm this plane's landing and couldn't contact the pilots either. The search operation lasted for several months, but they found nothing. Just like in the Pan Am 914 case, the plane disappeared from radar while flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, the search operation ended, and Santiago Airlines ceased its activities. October 12, 1989. Airport controllers in Brazil noticed a passenger plane that suddenly appeared on their radar. It didn't answer the airport staff's questions and just circled over the airbase. After a few minutes, the plane landed and nothing. No one opened the ramp. Passengers didn't get out. Pilots didn't respond. The aircraft was in perfect condition. One of the dispatchers realized that this was the missing Santiago Airlines Flight 513 that had been considered lost for 35 years. Airport staff approached the plane and opened the doors. What they saw there terrified them. The police, customs staff, doctors, detectives, and other airport staff members gathered around the plane. No one knew what to do next. There was no living person on board who could tell the truth. The plane disappeared in 1954 and appeared 35 years later in perfect condition without any damage. So far, no one has figured out what happened. Detective Anderson noticed the stories were very similar. Pan Am 914 disappeared in 1955. Santiago Airlines 513 vanished in 1954. The difference was almost a year. Anderson scratched his head and noticed another little detail. Both planes went missing from the radar the moment they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. There are many myths about phantom ships and mysterious phenomena connected with the Bermuda Triangle. Detective Anderson knew these tales, but these 2 missing planes puzzled him. He looked at 2 articles and understood everything. Exactly! The solution was there, right in front of his eyes. Both stories were written in the same newspaper. There was no real dispatcher who communicated with the planes. Nothing was known about the passengers. No newspapers except this one published news about these missing aircraft. It seemed they just took the same story and changed the dates, locations, and names of flights. Yes, the case was solved. It was all fake. The rain stopped. Detective Anderson looked out the window and heard the sound of a passing train. He remembered another weird and fake story. A story about a phantom train. It took place in Italy in 1911. 100 passengers boarded the train of the Zanetti Railway Company. It went through the picturesque mountainous area, got into a mountain tunnel, and disappeared. No one else had seen the train since then. All the passengers were lost, but not for long. They appeared in the past. There were records dated 1845. One unknown doctor from Mexico City wrote about 100 Italians who appeared in the city from nowhere. They were all dressed strangely and talked about one mysterious train. This was a completely made-up story. There was no proof or records about this train and the people who got into the past. A loud sound interrupted his thoughts. Detective Anderson picked up the phone. He was silently listening to the person on the other end of the line. A minute later, he answered, "Yes." The detective put the phone down. It was a new mystery for him. In the Sahara Desert, the locals noticed a huge ship lost in the South Pacific 27 years ago. There was no crew on board, no cargo, and no flags. No one knew how it appeared among the sand, but wet mud formed around it because of moisture. It seemed like the ship had just teleported there from the water. Perfect! No fakes this time. Detective Anderson put on his hat and left the office. But this story is for another video. You unbuckle your seatbelt and stand up, stretching your legs after a long flight. You head towards the restroom and think about freshening up. Suddenly, you're in the air. Luggage flies around you. It feels like the world is ending. You're 30,000 feet above the ground, and you're heading for a crash landing. Before you have any more time to think, everything goes black. In early 2001, a massive Boeing 747 carrying over 400 people took off from Tokyo Haneda International Airport. The flight progressed like normal until it reached 39,000 feet and coasting speed. Food was being served, and passengers were up and about like they would be on any other journey. Slightly earlier in the day, a Japanese airline flight between Busan, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan, had begun in a similar fashion. This one was smaller, with about 250 people on board. It had also started coasting at around 37,000 feet. Both of these planes were on a similar flight path, only 2,000 feet apart, and due to meet over the Japanese island of Honshu. They were both close to this intersection when the pilot of the Boeing 747 noticed his anti-collision indicator going off. This was when he first knew something was wrong. One of the critical aspects of modern air travel is the coordination of air traffic control. Every flight is monitored, and pilots are advised if anything goes wrong. The entire point of air traffic control is to organize flights so well that collisions are impossible. Every modern plane is built with collision monitors, but they are never supposed to be used because of this. While the anti-collision indicators buzzed, 26-year-old trainee Hideki Hachitani was sitting behind the radars at the control tower, monitoring both flights. The stress of having to oversee more than 10 planes was overwhelming him. This isn't surprising, given that he wasn't even certified to operate by himself without supervision. When he noticed the potential collision, he rushed to prevent a disaster. He quickly contacted the flight from Busan that was cruising at 37,000 feet and told them to dip lower, trying to create a bigger gap between the planes. In his rush, though, Hachitani had made a terrible mistake. He had contacted the wrong plane. Instead of telling the Boeing 747 to reduce its altitude, the pilot of the other plane followed Hachitani's instructions and lowered from 39,000 feet to 37,000 feet, the exact same height as the 747. Both planes sped toward each other at 500 miles per hour on a collision course. Hachitani was beginning to panic now. When he noticed that the flight from Busan hadn't descended, he quickly instructed it to turn right. The pilot had, of course, failed to follow the instructions given because they'd been sent to the wrong plane. For an unknown reason, the instruction to turn right failed to reach anyone at all this time. The communications from air traffic control were failing. and the pilots didn't have any idea of how much danger they were in. When seeing Hachitani panicking behind the control panel, his supervisor rushed to the scene and took control of the situation. She contacted the flight from Busan and now told it to climb up. Amazingly, when she did this, she gave the order to a flight that wasn't even operating that day. Both of the flights ignored her because they didn't know that the message was intended for them. The Boeing pilot was at least aware that there was another plane close by, but his faith in air traffic control would have comforted him. Surely, if anything was badly wrong, someone would send him more instructions? At this point, the crash was beginning to look inevitable. For the passengers on the flights, though, everything would have seemed to be normal. They might have been eating some snacks, stretching their legs, or maybe waiting in line for the toilet, completely unaware that they were on course to fly straight into another plane. Luckily for all of the 600-plus people involved, the pilot was well-trained and confident in a situation that would cause most people to freeze up. Through his windscreen, he saw something that no pilot should ever see: another plane heading directly for him. With cat-like reflexes and remarkable composure, the Boeing pilot gripped the throttle and steered the plane down as low as he could for the seconds he had before the collision. The Boeing flew straight underneath the other flight. Imagine being a pilot and seeing the ground in front of you instead of the sky. They both made it out intact. This man had saved the lives of more than 600 people. That isn't to say that everyone got out without a scratch. The passengers were completely unaware of the entire incident, so barely any were buckled in. They were powerless as the change in direction threw them against the inside of the plane. Out of nowhere, with the plane's sudden movement, many hit the roof with the force of a car crash. Every unsecured object and person were thrown through the air. Some might have even felt like the plane had just hit the ground. Miraculously, only 7 passengers and 2 crew members were seriously injured, and the rest only received minor injuries. The pilot circled back to Tokyo to allow all of the injuries to be treated. Thanks to the quick response of medical teams and unbelievable decision-making and skill shown by the pilot, everyone on the flight survived. Every time you travel on a plane, you're signing up to shoot through the sky at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour in a fragile metal shell. You're surrounded by enormous, dangerous motors, 6 or 7 miles above the ground. Surely there's no way you'd survive if the plane itself started to fail. The Hudson Bay landing shows that skilled pilots can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. On January 15, 2009, Flight 1549 was set to fly from New York to North Carolina. The pilot, Chesley Sullenberger, was a former jet pilot who converted to commercial flights in the 1980s. The sky was clear and the conditions were favorable. It was a typical flight for all of the 155 passengers on board, until the worst happened just a minute and a half in. As the plane climbed to 3,000 feet, they hit a flock of Canada geese. They hit the entire plane, but most importantly, some geese got caught in both engines. When Sullenberger realized that his engines were failing, he contacted air traffic control. They ordered him to land back at the airport, but he realized that it was impossible. With failing engines and no clear runway to land on, he had to take control of the situation to save the lives of everyone on board. Without full control of his plane, he wasn't able to operate at the normal altitude. He flew so low that he passed over the George Washington Bridge at only 900 feet. The people on the bridge were terrified to see the plane so close, but they had no idea how bad things were on board. With the plane speeding at 140 miles per hour, Sullenberger saw the Hudson River in front of him, and he had no choice but to land on it. Everyone in the control tower was shocked to hear what he had to do, but there was no other option. Landing on a runway is one thing, but commercial pilots aren't trained to land in a river. Sullenberger had to think clearly and plan the landing while flying towards the ground. He made sure to allow the tail to touch the water before the nose. Landing nose first would compromise the engines further and cause even more damage. Amazingly, the plane touched down on the water without falling apart. Their momentum gradually decreased until they were at a slow, steady pace across the surface. From a distance, people might have thought it was just a slow-moving boat. A ferry arrived impressively quickly to fetch the stranded passengers, who waited on the wings and the inflatable slides. Everyone received minor injuries from the collision with the river, but they all survived. Captain Sullenberger went down in history as one of the most remarkable pilots ever, having saved so many people from a seemingly hopeless situation. There was even a movie made about his heroics.
The plane had been in the air for a mere 25 seconds when the pilots noticed weird noises and bizarre vibrations. They tried several ways to improve the situation, but nothing worked. The engine surges continued, and just over a minute into the flight, when the plane reached 3,000 feet, both engines failed. First the right one, 2 seconds later the left one. The pilots decided to return to the airport they had just left. At the same time, they tried to restart the engines. Nothing seemed to work. The flight crew made a decision to pitch the plane down and then level it off. Perhaps it could help them gain some speed for the glide. But soon, they realized they wouldn't make it to the airport. Was the plane going to crash? That's when the miracle at Gotrura occurred. The morning before the flight started as usual. Regular pre-flight procedures, good weather. The members of the flight crew were experienced pilots. A 44-year-old Danish captain with over 8,000 flight hours under his belt, and a 34-year-old first officer from Sweden with 3,000 hours. So, what could go wrong? The plane itself was almost brand new. It was a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 nicknamed Dana Viking. It made its first flight on March 16, 1991. By that fateful day, the aircraft had been in service for a mere 9 months. There were 122 passengers and 7 crew members on board. Flight 751 Scandinavian Airlines was a scheduled flight from Stockholm, Sweden to Warsaw, Poland. On the way, the plane was supposed to make a stop in Copenhagen, Denmark. The aircraft took off from Stockholm according to its schedule at 8:47 a.m. local time. But by that point, the people inside had already been doomed, all because of a terrible sequence of events before the departure. It started the night before. The plane arrived at Stockholm Airport after a flight from Zurich. It was 10:09 p.m. The aircraft spent the night at the gate outside. It was cold. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. What made the situation even worse was that almost 6,000 pounds of freezing cold fuel, chilled during the night, still remained in the tanks located in the wings. The fuel was so cold because the plane had been flying at the cruising altitude, where the air temperature outside the cabin varied from minus 61 to minus 80 degrees. The flight from Zurich lasted around 1 hour and 40 minutes. Soon after midnight, a flight technician came to check on the aircraft. The man had to remove some slush from the landing gear. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to examine it. At around 2 a.m., when he was leaving, he noticed some ice covering the upper part of the wings. By the morning, the situation had become even dire. A layer of clear, almost invisible ice had formed on the tops of the wings. The plane had to leave the gate at around 8:30 a.m. An hour before the departure, the mechanic responsible for the plane noticed that some ice covered the underside of the wings. He decided to make sure there was no ice on the tops of the wings. He climbed a ladder and put one knee on the wing. Then he bent forward to touch the front part of the wing. There was no ice, just some slush. The mechanic decided to make sure everything was fine with the air inlet of one of the engines. He didn't find anything abnormal. Soon after that, the personnel used more than 220 gallons of de-icing fuel to remove ice from the plane. The mechanic consulted with the captain of the aircraft and ordered the staff to de-ice the underside of the wings as well. After all, he had seen some ice there. but no one thought to double-check if there was clear ice on the tops of the wings. After they had finished the procedure, the mechanic reported to the captain, "We're done here. De-icing finished. There was a lot of snow and ice, but everything's clear now." The captain thanked the mechanic and carried on with the pre-flight procedures. The plane taxied to the runway. Its engine's anti-ice systems were switched on and didn't show any malfunction. But several passengers later claimed they had seen ice sliding off the upper side of the wings while the plane had been taking off. And still, the plane left the ground and headed for Stockholm as usual. But shortly after the takeoff, several pieces of the overlooked ice broke off. At full speed, they slammed into the fans of the engines near the tail on both sides of the plane, ruining the blades. It led to a series of surges, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, somewhere in the cabin, Scandinavian Airlines flight captain Per Holmberg, who was on board as a passenger, noticed something was amiss. At first, he informed the flight attendant sitting in the rear jump seat that the right engine was surging. She tried to contact the flight crew, unsuccessfully. Then, the ununiformed captain rushed to the cockpit and asked if he could help the pilots. The first officer gave him the emergency checklist, and the captain asked him to start the auxiliary power unit, a small gas turbine in the tail of the plane. Holmberg's advice and help were invaluable, but was it enough to save the plane and the people inside? When the plane emerged from the cloud cover at an altitude of 890 feet, the pilots realized they wouldn't have enough time to make it back to the airport. An immediate emergency landing was unavoidable. The assisting captain passed the order to the cabin crew, and they started preparing the passengers. There was a large field to the north of the plane, but the captain realized they didn't have enough time to reach it. So he chose a much smaller field in a forested area in the direction of flight. It was not far from the village of Gotrura in Uppland, Sweden. The plane was just 1,300 feet above the ground when the assisting captain started extending the flaps. At a height of 183 feet, the captain reported to Stockholm Control, "We're crashing to the ground." 7 seconds later, the plane hit several trees and lost a huge chunk of its right wing. By that time, the landing gear had already been extended and the speed had decreased to 139 miles per hour. Moments later, the plane's tail struck the ground and broke off. The aircraft kept sliding across the field, still at high speed. It traveled 360 feet, with its main landing gear leaving marks on the field. At one point, the plane lost the main and nose landing gear. Its fuselage broke into 3 parts. Miraculously, there was no fire. If you look at the pictures from the crash site, the plane torn into pieces, with its parts scattered across the field, it's hard to believe that all 129 people on board the plane survived. It seems like a miracle, but it was also thanks to the flight attendants' quick reaction and the correct instructions they gave the passengers. They didn't panic and told the people to adopt the brace position just in time to avoid fatalities. Even more surprising, almost all passengers, except for 4 people, made their way out of the plane on their own. No wonder this accident was nicknamed the Miracle. The aircraft, though, wasn't as lucky. The 9-month-old plane was damaged so badly that it was an immediate write-off. Everyone praised the actions of the flight crew. The landing was incredibly skilled, especially in such a fast-developing, very dangerous situation. The captain himself admitted that few pilots were ever forced to put to the test the skills they got during training, at least not to this degree. He said he was proud of his crew and relieved that everyone had survived, and he never returned to piloting commercial planes.
Hey, look at this stunning futuristic interior. It's a long studio room with a low ceiling, white walls, and windows overlooking the forest. And there's also a large panoramic window in the corner. You can easily invite hundreds of guests here, and they will all be impressed. So what, would you like to buy or rent this spot? Oh, there's another minor nuance. This house is an airplane. Unfortunately, you can only fly somewhere on it if you invest a couple of $1 million for repairs, but it's possible to live here. A resident of Oregon, Bruce Campbell, created this place. He turned a giant Boeing 727 into his home, where he spends about 6 months every year. Bruce installed 2 bathrooms and a shower, made a kitchen, and equipped this place with electricity. It has everything you need for a comfortable stay. But the most incredible thing is that you can create precisely the same house. To understand how to do this, let's look at Bruce's story. As a teenager, he was watching TV when he saw a report of an aircraft boneyard. These iron birds amazed him and inspired him to create a new home. Growing up, Bruce began to study electrical engineering and always remembered his teenage dream. In the 70s, he bought 10 acres of land in the woods near the town of Hillsboro, Oregon. This area is approximately equal to 8 football fields. After that, he began to look for a plane. In 1999, he hired a rescue company to help him find a Boeing. Soon, they found a 200-seat passenger aircraft in Greece. Since the plane was already out of order and no one would fly it, Bruce bought it for little money. It was just $100,000. The amount is small, considering that a new Boeing costs about $100 million. Airport staff removed the engine and fuel from the plane, disassembled it, and sent it to Oregon. After the logistics problems were solved and the plane ended up in the woods, Bruce began to turn it into a house. The repair work lasted several years. When everything was ready, the media found out about Bruce and made him a celebrity. He showed that even such gigantic things as an airplane could be recycled. Bruce invites anyone to his house to show that airplanes can be used for cheap housing. The advantages of such a house are that the airplane's outer layer can protect from cold, moisture, wind, and sun. Every year in the US, several hundred aircraft break down. People transport them to the aircraft boneyard, where these planes are waiting for repairs or turning into scrap metal. And many of them are in good condition. Another unusual house is located in Tokyo, Japan. It's definitely not your choice if you go to relax alone or think that home is a place where no one can bother you. Welcome to the transparent house. It looks pretty stylish. There are huge panoramic windows without curtains and no walls and doors between the rooms. There are a bunch of large shelves and ladders inside. You can climb, jump, and hang here. The height of the house is 3 floors. It looks like a modern urban tree house. This place is open to everyone. And now, take a look at the most fantastic tree house. Can you see it? No? No wonder. This house is almost invisible in the forest because of its mirrored surface. It's called Mirror Tree House and is located in Sweden. At night with the lights off, this small building completely merges with nature. Now turn on the lights in the windows and take a closer look. This is a stylish and modern building where anyone can spend the night. You need to pay for it though because it's a hotel. Here's another tree house. More precisely, it's a huge building built on several trees. It's called Minister's Tree House and is located in Crossville, Tennessee. It's considered to be the biggest tree house in the world. It's built from recycled wood. It occupies almost 5 floors in height and has several rooms. If elves lived in the forest, then this house would be their bank or the administration of the woods. Let's get down from the trees to the ground, more precisely, under the ground. It's not even a house, but a small town. And every building here is pretty unusual. You won't see this town from the outside. All houses, cafes, post offices, and other buildings are located in the pits from which pipes protrude, releasing steam. Welcome to Coober Pedy, Australia. Enter any house and see that there is ground instead of the usual walls and wallpaper. Such unusual architecture is because this place is the world's largest reserve of opal. Most of these minerals, which are sold all over the world, are mined in this city. Opal was first found in these lands in 1915. Since then, people have been coming here to search for precious stones. There are no mining companies here because it's impossible to determine large deposits of opal with the help of technology. Therefore, people mine it manually with picks and shovels. This work is quite long and difficult. So, the town residents rent a place where they dig and build a house. Spread your arms in different directions. That's the width of our next house. The distance from one wall to the other is less than the length of your body. It looks tiny, but people are happy to live here. Welcome to the Current House. The narrowest house in the world is located in Poland. On the streets of Warsaw, you will easily notice it. It's like it's stuck between two buildings. Everything is pretty cute and stylish inside. The white interior adds a feeling of extra space. The Current House serves as a transit point for travel writers. If you're working on a book, this place will be a great source of inspiration for you. This house looks like something from another planet. It's called Robert Bruno's Steel House. It stands on 4 legs, has a strangely shaped window, and is made of metal. This strange house is located in Ransom Canyon, Texas. This is the creation of the sculptor Robert Bruno. He built it from the 70s until 2008. He used about 150 tons of blackened steel and made every detail by hand. Unfortunately, the sculptor passed away before he could complete his masterpiece. There's a toilet house in South Korea, close to Seoul. This big building looks like a giant toilet bowl. It's made of steel, white concrete, and glass. The purpose of this house is to promote the hygiene and sanitation of toilets. Many diseases are spread because of poor cleaning. Inside the toilet, you will find 2 guest rooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bathrooms. And to rent the whole building, you need to pay about $50,000. Looking at this house in one of the alleys of London, it may seem to you that the building is about to fall apart. The house was built in the 16th century and originally didn't look like this. But in 1687, the city council ordered the demolition of the building to free space for something else. The house was almost destroyed, but its owner sued the city council. He won the case and the council was obliged to restore the house. But they did it in a hurry, using cheap materials. For many years, the wood has been bending and the house has got such an unusual shape. Let's end our realtor's journey with this fun house. People who love skateboarding will be delighted to visit this place. Welcome to Skateboard House Malibu, California. You don't leave your home to start riding. The whole house has a circular curved shape and there's no corners in it. There are beds and tables here, which you can also use for tricks. An engine explodes during takeoff. The water injection system is switched off, and communication is lost. Now, this doomed plane faces the imminent threat of crashing into Athens or a hill. Will the captain be able to defy all odds and save over 400 lives on board? Stay tuned. It's 2 in the afternoon. A Boeing 747 starts rolling down the runway, picking up speed. Just as Captain Sifis Migadis lifts the nose of the aircraft, he's surprised by a loud bang. He has no idea what's just happened, but he's left with no options. The fully loaded plane is moving too fast to stop on the short runway space still left. The airplane begins its risky takeoff, and it's now heading straight for downtown Athens, which is absolutely crowded on a hot summer evening in August 9th, 1978. After the loud explosion, a flight attendant in the back takes the intercom and warns the crew about the catastrophic failure of engine number 3 located on the right side of the airplane. The flight attendant says, "I think we're screwed." And here's an honest, "Yeah, I know." The original plan of the Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a direct shot from Athens to New York. But now, this massive 370-ton jumbo jet simply doesn't have enough power to keep going up. The stress is through the roof. The flight is fully loaded with 18 crew members and 400 passengers. who are mostly US citizens returning from their Greek summer vacation. Little do they know that the pilot still has to face 4 major problems in a 93-second period to ensure everyone stays alive. The first issue has to do with water injection. You see, this Boeing has 4 engines. Engine number 3 has just exploded, and engine number 2 is operating with reduced power after maintenance. So the pilot needs the remaining engines to give their all to get this plane climbing. The thing is, pushing the engines to the max creates a ton of heat. So, Captain Migatis asks the onboard flight engineer to double-check if the cooling system is on, preventing the engines from getting too hot and maintaining a safe temperature. It's a bit tricky to explain what went wrong at this point, but experts think that in the heat of the moment, the flight engineer might have gotten a little mixed up. Instead of ensuring the water injection is on, he does the opposite and switches the system off just 9 seconds after takeoff. This mistake further reduces the power in the engines, limiting the plane's ability to climb by causing a loss of 4,500 pounds of thrust. So now, the plane finds itself in a seriously bad situation, barely cruising over the rooftops at below minimum speed. The second issue with this doomed aircraft involves the landing gear. The 55-year-old pilot had already had over 30 years of experience when he was assigned to command this flight. So he decides to make a bold move by telling his co-pilot to pull up the wheels at 35 feet above the runway. This move isn't just risky, it's straight up against Boeing rules in situations like this. Pilots usually have to wait until the aircraft gains a bit more altitude to pull up the wheels, because popping those landing gear doors open for 15 seconds adds more resistance against the plane's forward motion. In other words, it basically slows the plane down, and that's why the co-pilot hesitates for a second before agreeing to break the rule. Against all odds, the 411 flight stays in the air, but the problems are far from over. This leads us to the third issue. The plane is getting dangerously close to hitting one of the oldest capital cities in the world, Athens. The flight started from Ellinikon International Airport. This was the main airport for the Greek capital for decades, and it was known as one of the trickiest and riskiest airports in the world. Picture this: 2 short runways, side by side, squeezed between the Aegean Sea and large mountains. Even though there were 2 runways, they mostly used just one, the one pointing planes straight at the center of Athens. Because of that, pilots had to make an immediate left turn right after takeoff, changing the flight path over the sea. Now you might be wondering, why doesn't Migatis just turn left already? Well, the speed of the 747 is way lower than it should be at this point. If he makes a turn, the plane might descend even more, upping the chances of crashing right into the city. So, the captain decides to keep climbing, following a straight path while he's figuring out Plan B. Do you remember that the airport is surrounded by mountains? Well, this is problem number 4. The pilot knows that in about a mile, the airplane will face a hill that's about 200 feet tall. As Migatis watches Pawnee Hill getting closer and closer, he decides to give up a few knots of airspeed to gain the altitude he desperately needs to fly over the hill. Migatis feels relief when he sees that his risky plan has worked. The airplane flies over the hill with only 9 feet to spare. Yet, the relief fades quickly. He still needs to come up with an emergency landing plan. Imagine the cockpit eerily silent. They don't have contact with the tower anymore. While the 2 pilots are doing everything they can to keep Flight 411 from crashing, the flight engineer is still focused on fixing the problems with the engines. The terrain gets lower after the plane flies over Pawnee Hill, so the captain decides to lower the nose of the plane to trade a bit of altitude for speed. But nothing happens. In fact, the airplane's speed just keeps dropping, and they're barely exceeding an altitude of 200 feet. The plane is so low that it's even taking down some television antennas. It's around the height of a 14-story building named the Inter-American Tower. the airplane gets so close to that building that some flight attendants can actually see people's faces inside. A happy ending seems unreal as the plane is approaching a catastrophic collision with Mount Aigaleo, which is over 1,500 feet high. But suddenly, the engines kick in with more power and the plane starts picking up speed. Some specialists believe the acceleration was due to the combination of three things. The wind shifted, the temperature outside dropped, and the water injection system kicked back in. And the good news is that with more power in the engines, the pilot successfully gains altitude. By 2:05, Migatis managed to turn left, avoiding a collision with Mount Aigaleo. The plane is heading towards the ocean. It keeps flying for over 30 minutes to dump fuel. The idea is to make the aircraft lighter before landing, as it's loaded with 160 tons of fuel needed for the transatlantic flight. After that, the captain brings the aircraft back to the same runway from which they took off, and they land safely at Aachen Airport. Everyone on board is safe, not a scratch on them, all thanks to this pilot who bravely broke the rules to save his crew and passengers. Now, picture the wild applause on the ground, and Migatis' daughters eagerly waiting for their father as he exits the plane. And it's no small feat, this pilot did the unthinkable. To put it in perspective, every Boeing simulation of this same flight ended in a crash. Migatis' impressive achievement led Olympic Airways to modify some of its procedures, and Boeing began to include a review of this case in its training curriculum. Now, you might be thinking that Migatis was traumatized after this accident and never wanted to board an aircraft again. But nope. Remember, we're talking about a real hero. At 6 p.m. on that same day, Migatis took his seat in the cockpit of a replacement Boeing 747 and flew 400 passengers over the Atlantic to New York. As for the aircraft, it stuck around with Olympic Airways for a couple of years until it joined Trans World Airlines in 1985. This 747 Boeing's career ended in 1997 after 24 years of service.
A plane with no identification marks is approaching the coast of Indonesia. It's not the most peaceful of times, and the flight operator is alarmed. 2 fighter jets take to the sky, about to take down the unidentified plane. It's all about to end in a disaster, when the fighters notice one strange detail. December 1st, 1941. Captain of a Boeing 314, Robert Ford and his team are preparing for one of the longest flights on one of the biggest planes in the world. The Boeing 314 Clipper California is a high-capacity seaplane. It has no landing gear, so it can only land on water. Its length is 100 feet, and its wingspan is 150 feet. This is more than a 6-story building, and on board this plane, there is a restaurant, resting areas, and even a room with a bed. Despite its size, the Clipper California can stay in the air for more than 18 hours. Captain Ford doesn't suspect what is awaiting him ahead. He gets on the plane. Their flight is bound from San Francisco to Auckland, New Zealand. The first stop is Los Angeles. There's no problem with this. The next stop is Pearl Harbor. The flight is going fine. December 7th, 1941. It's been 3 days since the plane left Pearl Harbor. The last final step of the journey remains: flight to New Zealand. At this moment, Captain Ford receives an order to return the plane to the nearest Allied base. The way back is closed, so the plane continues to fly to Auckland. The Clipper lands safely at the Auckland airport and receives an order that seems impossible. Robert Ford and his team must paint over all the registration and identification marks on the plane and deliver it to LaGuardia, New York. Then, fly across the world. This is an uncharted route with a length of 23,000 miles. In the entire history of aviation at this time, no one has flown such a distance. The team doesn't have maps or modern navigation devices. They don't know the lands they will fly over. They don't know who they may meet on their way and at which airports they will land. They must maintain and repair the plane themselves, extract fuel, and plot the route. At the same time, they have almost no money. Immediately after receiving the order, the team goes to the Auckland Library. They study all the atlases and maps to create a detailed flight plan. First, they need to get to Australia, then fly to Africa along the coast of Asia. and then they should go to the US. The crew paint all over the signs on the plane and prepare for takeoff. Fortunately, before the start, one banker finds about their situation and gives them $500. The plane takes off. The team didn't notice they forgot to paint over the American flag. In a few days, it will save their lives. Before Australia, they fly to New Caledonia to evacuate a group of people from there and deliver them to Australia. The operation is successful. In Australia, the team needs to refuel the plane. They don't find special transport for Clipper services at that airport, so the crew themselves transport 800 cans of gasoline. And here's an important detail. The Boeing 314 doesn't use conventional fuel. It needs to be filled with special high-octane aviation gasoline. Early in the morning, the Clipper takes off and heads to Indonesia. The flight is going fine. They are approaching the airport. Meanwhile, the captain of the base where the Clipper is supposed to land notices an unidentified plane. He doesn't know who's flying it and from where. No one warned him about it. It may be an enemy plane. 2 fighter jets take to the sky. They are approaching the Clipper and don't see any identification marks on its body. The pilots are about to attack, but at that moment, they notice an American flag. If Robert Ford hadn't forgotten to paint it over, then everything would have ended badly for him and his crew. The fighters allow landing. The Clipper lands on the water. A boat floats towards it to meet the plane's crew, but stops. It turns out the plane landed on a place filled with sea mines, so the boat doesn't dare to sail there. The Clipper approaches the port and miraculously avoids contact with mines. Robert Ford and the crew of the plane are well met. They are going too quickly to rest and hit the road. But then, a big problem surfaces. The plane is running out of fuel, and at that naval base, there is only ordinary automobile gas. Nobody knows if the plane engine is going to go with it. It may burn out or stop working altogether, but there's no choice. They fill the tanks with ordinary fuel. Captain decides to take off using the remnants of aviation fuel, and during the flight, they switch to tanks with ordinary gasoline. When this happens, the plane's engine begins to clap and rattle, but after a while, it calms down. The flight continues. For 19 hours, they fly on dangerous fuel. Their next stop is Ceylon. The sky is covered with clouds. The pilot doesn't see the coast in the airport, so he decides to lower the plane below the clouds. They fly at an altitude of 300 feet above the surface of the sea and notice a huge whale ahead. The plane flies closer, and it turns out it's not a whale. It's an enemy ship. The Clipper begins to gain altitude to hide back into the clouds. Finally, they are again surrounded by a white veil. The booms and blasts are heard behind and below the plane. The Clipper's flying with zero visibility for 60 minutes. Finally, the clouds are clearing and they see the port of Ceylon. The team makes a short stopover and proceeds with its journey. As soon as the plane takes off, one of the engines explodes. Fortunately, they didn't have time to fly far from the port, so they successfully landed the plane on the water and repaired the engine. The Clipper continues its mission. Now, Robert Ford's team flies mainly over land. This is very risky, since the aircraft doesn't have landing gear and it can't safely land on solid ground. Finally, they get to the Congo. The team has a great time here, gains strength, rests, and most importantly, gets high-octane aviation gasoline. Things are going great, but there's another ordeal ahead. Now, the aviators will have to make the longest flight in their journey. Their next stop is a port town in Brazil, and the distance to it is 3,500 miles across the ocean. The maximum flight distance of the Boeing is 3,700 miles. Any deviation from the course or a strong headwind can easily prevent the aircraft from reaching the port. Worried, the crew refill the tank and load additional fuel onto the plane. They leave the Congo, taking off along the narrow river. At this moment, the pilot notices the river ends a few miles away with a waterfall. The plane must urgently gain altitude, but it can't. The large amount of additional fuel bears the Clipper down. The waterfall is getting closer. In the last seconds, the plane manages to rise to the desired height. But even after the waterfall, Boeing still doesn't get high enough. It hovers right above the rocky coastal cliffs. A slight inclination can lead to a crash. Fortunately, they manage to pass unharmed. The plane rises to the perfect height. During the flight from the Congo to Brazil, the crew broke a new record. It's 23 hours and 35 minutes in the air. The tired crew make a long-awaited landing in the city of Natal. However, the rest doesn't last long. 2 hours later, they take to the air and head to the next stop, an airbase in Panama. January 6, 1942, 5:54 a.m. The already legendary Boeing 314 is approaching LaGuardia, New York. The team can't wait to finish their journey. They contact the dispatch, and he tells them they can't land the plane only after 7 a.m., since the air terminal starts working at this time. For an hour, Robert Ford and his crew are circling in the air. It was probably the longest hour of their lives. Finally, the mission is complete. The Boeing 314 becomes the first passenger plane to make an almost around-the-world trip. This long flight lasted more than a month. This plane spent 209 hours or 8 days in the air. During this time, it covered more than 30,000 miles and made 18 landings.
Pan American Flight 6 was finishing an around-the-world trip with several stops on its way. On October 16, 1956, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, dubbed Sovereign of the Skies, left Honolulu and was heading for San Francisco. It was the flight's last leg, but no one could predict this phrase would turn out to be not just a figure of speech. The plane had to start its journey at 7:30 p.m., but some maintenance issues delayed boarding for almost an hour. The passengers were getting a bit impatient. The plane finally took off at 8:26 p.m. and soon reached the altitude of 13,000 feet. For some time, the aircraft was experiencing turbulence, which made it impossible to serve dinner. Several hours later, the lights were dimmed and the passengers stretched across empty seats preparing to have a peaceful sleep. Little did they know that sleep was the last thing they were going to get that night. At about 1 a.m., the cockpit crew got permission to climb to 21,000 feet, but once the aircraft reached the needed height, a terrible thing happened. At 1:20 a.m., one of the plane's engines started to overspeed. George Hacker, the first officer flying the plane, tried to deal with this problem by slowing the plane down. It didn't work out. This made Captain Richard Ogg cut off the oil supply to the engine altogether. After a while, the engine conked out, but its propeller kept windmilling in the airstream. It caused the aircraft to start losing precious fuel and seriously slowed down its speed. The plane was moving far too slowly now, just 174 miles per hour. It was also losing altitude at an alarming pace, at the rate of 1,000 feet per minute. The three remaining engines were struggling, trying to decrease the breakneck speed of the descent. At least, they were still functioning. It made the pilots feel somewhat hopeful. But all of a sudden, the captain noticed that the fourth engine started to fail. It was producing just a bit of power, even though it was working at full throttle. At 2:45 a.m., the unavoidable happened. The fourth engine started to backfire, and the pilots had to shut it down. Now the plane had only 2 working engines and was moving more and more slowly. The crew calculated how much fuel the aircraft was consuming, and a heavy silence filled the cockpit. The pilots had nothing to do but face the awful truth. The plane didn't have enough fuel to reach San Francisco. Neither could it return to Honolulu. Captain Ogg sent a radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard. Pan Am 90943, Flight 6, declares an emergency over the Pacific. At that time, a Coast Guard cutter was always on patrol between Hawaii and the California coast. Such ships passed on radio messages to the nearest airplanes and provided them with weather information. They were usually placed near the points of no return. Those were the areas where a plane would have already burned so much fuel that it wouldn't have a chance to turn back if something went wrong. That night, the Coast Guard cutter was the 255-foot Pontchartrain, and William Earl was the commander. The plane headed toward the ship and leveled off at an altitude of 2,000 feet. Then it started to fly above the ship in 8-mile circles, waiting for daylight. It was crucial to see the surroundings because the pilots had to keep the aircraft's wings level with the ocean, and it would be impossible in the dark. During the day, it would also be easier to rescue all the passengers. The captain's decision to ditch the plane carrying 24 passengers and 7 crew members wasn't an easy or hurried one. He had to weigh numerous factors. Should I get rid of the fuel to make the plane lighter? Should I land now or wait until daylight and better visibility? But one thing was crystal clear. Having lost 2 engines, the plane was burning the fuel too fast. There was no other solution but to ditch into the ocean. As the Stratocruiser was circling the Coast Guard cutter, it managed to climb from 2,000 to 5,000 feet. It caused the plane to consume more fuel and become lighter, which was a good thing. The lighter the aircraft, the longer it would float on the surface. Plus, it lowered the risk of fire after a crash landing. The captain knew about an accident that had happened with another Pan Am Stratocruiser. That time, the plane's tail broke off. That's why Captain Ogg asked the passengers in the back to move toward the front part of the plane. Those who were sitting by the engines had to relocate too. Flight attendants removed all loose objects in the cabin and explained to the passengers what to expect. Since the problem started, the crew members had been doing their best to calm down the terrified people. When the passengers found out the plane was going to circle and wasn't landing in the dark, they were hugely relieved. Another comforting thought was that the Coast Guard cutter was out there, ready to provide them with as much help as possible. Luckily, the weather was good, and the ocean was very calm. At 5:40 a.m., Captain Ogg informed the cutter he was ready to ditch. The ship left a thick foam path in the water to help the pilots understand their height above the surface more clearly. At 6:15 a.m., the plane touched down. It was still moving at a speed of 105 miles per hour. It had already traveled several hundred feet along the surface and started to slow down when the worst possible thing happened. One of the wings hit a wave, the aircraft rotated nearly 180 degrees, and its tail broke off. After that, in a matter of seconds, the plane's nose went under the water. One of those who had been on board the plane said later that all he could see at that terrifying moment was water. It seemed to be everywhere. But after less than a minute, it started to recede. The front of the plane resurfaced. People on the Pontchartrain were staring at the disaster unfolding in front of their eyes, feeling numb. They were devastated. No one could possibly survive such a crash landing. But they were very, very wrong. All 31 people on board the plane were alive. Even more astonishingly, there had been just a couple of minor injuries. Once those on board the Pontchartrain realized the passengers and crew had survived, several rescue boats rushed toward the wreckage. Meanwhile, the captain and those passengers who had been assigned to help with the evacuation quickly deployed 3 life rafts. But when people started to climb on one of them, it became obvious the raft hadn't inflated properly. It started to sink. Luckily, the rescue boats were on time. They promptly transferred the passengers from the damaged raft to the cutter. At 6:35 a.m., the last piece of the wreckage vanished in the waves. By that time, all the people from the aircraft had already got to the safety of the Coast Guard ship. They stayed in the cutter's officers' quarters and reached San Francisco several days later. Pan American Flight 6 crash landing was the first accident when an airliner ditched into the ocean but managed to keep everyone on board safe. And the whole blood-curdling event was captured on camera. Life rafts bobbing by the plane's side, survivors being transferred to the rescue boats, the plane rapidly sinking and disappearing among waves. Sometime later, all the crew members got awards for tackling the emergency and keeping the passengers safe. Captain Richard Ogg was the first person to receive the Civilian Airmanship Award presented for the most outstanding skills and heroism. Her name is Lillian Boyer. Wait a minute, why is she standing on the wing of an airplane? Well, from 1921, Lillian made a living doing completely crazy mid-air stunts on planes. She really knew how to put on a good show, and she became famous all over the United States. But Lillian started her unusual career completely by accident. She was a regular 21-year-old waitress at a Chicago restaurant. That changed when 2 pilots named Elmer Partridge and Johnny Metzger became frequent customers there. One day, they offered Lillian a ride in their old biplane, a Curtiss JN-4D Jenny. She agreed, and they headed over to the local airport. Soon, Lillian was in the air. It was the first flight of her life, and she was incredibly excited. Flying didn't scare her at all. In fact, with a strong wind blowing in her face and the noise of the engine ringing in her ears, Lillian realized that planes were her calling. 4 days later, Partridge asked her if she wanted to take another flight. This time, Lillian decided to do something bold. When the plane was flying at 65 miles an hour, she got out of her seat and stood on the wing. But even then, she wanted more. So she walked all the way to the edge. The whole time, Partridge was screaming at her to sit down because he thought she was going to jump. She could barely hear his voice because of the engine noise. But Lillian wasn't scared at all. She actually enjoyed it. When the pilot saw what she could do, he introduced her to Billy Brock. He worked at the Chattanooga airport and was looking for someone who could do tricks on the wing of a plane. They shook hands and soon got started on Lillian's training. Lillian quit her restaurant job and started training full-time. For 5 months, she practiced doing stunts in a barn at Chattanooga. She used a model plane which had soft mattresses placed underneath it for safety. She did gymnastics with an instructor, as well as running and other sports, and she changed her eating habits. Soon, she was ready for a real flight. And she proved she was the best. Lillian was the first female stunt person to perform tricks like hanging from a plane using one hand or hanging by her knees or ankles. Her bravery amazed people, and she quickly became very popular. She and Brock started doing air shows at various fairs and festivals, and she turned into a real star. When they came to town, the crowd always recognized them. There was always a car waiting for Lillian, and she had a lot of passionate fans. Lillian was the only woman at the time who could perform one very risky stunt. She would get out of the cockpit holding a thin wire, which had a mouthpiece at the end of it. She would do a few tricks on the edge of the wing and then hang under the plane, holding on by only her teeth. The spectators couldn't see the wire from hundreds of feet below, so it looked both pretty shocking and amazing. The crowd would erupt into screams when Lillian performed this trick. Then Brock would lower a special ladder and she'd grab it and go back to her seat. But there were also accidents. These reminded Lillian and Brock that they were engaged in a very dangerous business and that they had to be as careful as possible. During one of their shows in 1924, they planned to do an unusual trick. Brock was going to do a loop while Lillian was standing on the biplane's top wings. The idea was for her to slip her feet into some straps, and the centrifugal force of the loop would help Lillian keep her balance. But during the actual trip, something went wrong and the strap broke. Lillian smashed really hard into the wing, but she still managed to climb back into her seat. She was injured, but she kept on doing her shows. When she was performing in Trenton, New Jersey, in October 1925, Lillian had another 3 accidents during some parachute jumps. On the first day of the show, the wind took her away from her landing spot and she fell onto the seat of a Ferris wheel. Some of the audience thought it was just another crazy stunt, but it was actually a very dangerous situation. Luckily, the Ferris wheel operator realized that Lillian was in trouble and stopped the ride. The second time, she couldn't control her chute and struck the roof of the grandstand. She hit it hard and got stuck there, and people had to look for a ladder to help Lillian down. On the third day of her show, Lillian's parachute almost landed on a tent, so she pulled on the shrouds as hard as she could to change direction. But this made the parachute turn inside out, and Lillian fell about 50 feet straight into the ground. She suffered a lot of injuries and had to be hospitalized, but she was treated very well. She was in the hospital for 2 months, and all of her bills were paid by an anonymous person. Lillian thought it was probably the president of the fair. He liked her. In fact, since she was a star, a lot of men admired her. But she didn't risk her life for money or fame. Lillian did all this for herself. Brock got almost all the money from their performances, and that was her decision. They usually perform for 2 or 3 days straight, or even a whole week. They were paid $1,000 to $1,200 for one performance, but Lillian only got $100. As she said herself, that was a decent amount of money, and it was enough for her. So Brock ran the business, maintained the plane, and hired mechanics and crew. But their show was called Lillian Boyer's Flying Circus, and there was a reason for that. Brock was in love with Lillian. Constantly working together made the two of them close. It didn't work out though. Lillian told him that there wouldn't be anything between them. But he still cared about her, and Lillian really appreciated him for that. She trusted her pilot with her life, and she admired his skill. In fact, she said he was the best pilot she ever knew. Before every flight, he double-checked all the systems, wires, and mechanisms. He would tell her where to go, and Lillian would listen to him. And it was Brock who came up with most of the tricks. There was total trust between them, and they worked as one. After Brock passed away, Lillian kept doing stunts with another pilot, but she couldn't trust him like she had trusted Brock. One of her signature tricks was switching from a car to a plane, but she never did it with the new pilot. During her stunt career between 1921 and 1928, Lillian performed 352 shows in 41 U.S. states and Canada. She performed 143 changes from a car to a plane and made 37 parachute jumps. But in 1928, low-altitude flying was banned, and so dangerous stunts performed on the wings of airplanes became history. Almost half a century later, Lillian once again became a celebrity at the San Diego Aerospace Museum. An entire section of it was devoted to her incredible achievements. Lillian was the guest of honor at all the events there. One evening, she was given one of the most pleasant surprises of her life. It was a flight on a Boeing PT-17 biplane. This time, now in her 80s, Lillian didn't walk on the wings or perform dangerous stunts. But when she landed, she admitted that she really wanted to. The pilot had told her not to get out of the cockpit. Plus, she couldn't trust him as much as she had trusted Brock. A lot of weird incidents have happened in the mysterious valley of Haizu ever since the 1950s. People even started comparing it to the infamous Bermuda Triangle. But are they really that similar? It all started when an airplane went missing here under circumstances no one can explain yet. They searched the location back and forth, but nothing appeared to have remained of the aircraft. And guess what? No one received any SOS messages from the team on board. And to top it off, the same year, a considerable number of tourists and local residents were lost here in the valley, never to be seen again. Speaking of the Bermuda Triangle, one can link its origin story to a series of mysterious disappearances of ships and aircraft, like the one that happened in 1945, when 5 planes and 14 people on board went missing in this location while doing routine training exercises. Even a thorough investigation didn't help to establish the cause of the incident. But that wasn't the end. Between 1945 and the mid-1980s, another 25 small planes went missing while going through the Bermuda Triangle, never to be seen again. And the search parties haven't recovered a single piece of these aircraft. The Bermuda Triangle isn't the only stretch of water that has claimed ships for good. In the Pacific Ocean, near Japan, there's a tricky portion of water that has earned the nickname the Devil's Sea. The best known out of all of these disappearances is that of a fishery patrol vessel that went missing in 1953. On board were 31 crew members and scientists who were looking to investigate a recently formed volcanic island. What happened to the ship and all the people on board? We'll never know, I guess, since they never found the ship or the crew members, and there was literally no trace of them left behind. Back in 1911, a standard train was scheduled to depart from a railway station in Rome, hoping to reach the city of Milan. Needless to say, none of the 106 passengers ever made it to the destination, and no one has ever seen them again. What happened to these people and to their train? Were they really lost forever? Some people seem to believe this isn't the case. As it was completing its journey, the train was supposed to pass through a long tunnel. It did enter it, but never came out the other end of the tunnel. Nothing was left of the train, and it seemed like it literally just vanished into thin air. Only 2 of the passengers were found, but they were quite unwell at the time, and their stories did not seem to make much sense. They spoke of a dense fog that they simply jumped out of because they got so scared. 15 years later, a story spread about a group of 104 Italian people that popped up in Mexico City, claiming they had arrived by train from Rome. If that's not weird enough, the story appears to have been reported back in 1845, 66 years before the train even departed in the first place. Of course, nobody at the time actually took these people seriously, but you can't help but wonder, did they actually time travel via the Roman tunnel, or is it just another urban myth? What do you think? The Lost Colony is the story of a strange phenomenon that happened back in the late 1500s. A group of people from England had moved into a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. But they soon realized they didn't have enough supplies. To fix this, the colony's governor decided to head back to England to get some. He didn't manage to come back for another 3 years. When he finally did, he was astonished at what was left behind. Nothing. The entire population of the colony was gone. The only reminder of what had been there was a single word carved into a tree. To this day, nobody knows what might have happened to these people or what the carved word means. A lighthouse without an operator? You might think that can't possibly be true, but hear me out. Located in the northwestern part of Scotland are the Flannan Isles. There's nothing fancy about them since they're nothing more than a bunch of rocks and grass. But there is a famous lighthouse here hiding a dark secret. In 1900, all 3 of the lighthouse's keepers mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. Ever since, the islands have been completely abandoned. The lighthouse became one of those with an automated system in the 1970s. No list of places where things go missing could be complete without this mysterious forest located in Transylvania, a region in Romania. And no, it has nothing to do with the famous Count Dracula, if that's what you're thinking. It's called the Hoya Forest, and it's a place that has seen quite its share of unusual phenomena. Not only do people go missing here, but others have experienced all sorts of weird noises, from female voices to whispers. Some people claim to have time traveled between the spooky trees of the Hoya Forest. They say they had literally skipped a few hours before they went back. The Yellowhead Highway is a stretch of road located in British Columbia, Canada. One section of the road has received a lot of attention throughout the years, starting with the 1960s because of some mysterious disappearances. These events have earned it the nickname Highway of Tears. There is no reasonable explanation as to why people keep going missing here. What is more striking is that most of these people were young women. This triangular area that stretches above the desert and the Sierra Nevada mountains in the state of Nevada received quite a bit of attention because of a disappearance that happened back in 2007. A record-setting sailor, aviator, and adventurer named Steve Fawcett flew here in a small plane and then disappeared. They searched for Fawcett intensively for months, but didn't find any traces of him or the aircraft. 1 year later, the mystery of Fawcett's fate was finally solved when a hiker came across his ID cards, and later a search party found the plane's wreckage. It's one of the most visited natural resorts in the world, but Yosemite National Park carries some dark secrets of its own. Despite its beauty and abundance of wildlife, a total of 45 people went missing right here in this location. No one knows what happened to them. Hey, maybe we should ask the local bears. They might know something. There are even stories of people that disappeared from one region of the park only to pop up in a completely different location. This hasn't stopped over 3 million people that visit the park each year from wandering around this location, though. Whenever a ship happens to sink, you'd expect to at least find pieces of it on the bottom of the sea, right? Well, not if you're traveling through Lake Superior. It's located along the border of the United States and Canada, and became famous because of the great number of ships that went missing here. It may have something to do with the stormy winds, of course, but that doesn't explain why some ships simply vanish altogether, without a single piece of them ever to be found, not even at the bottom of the lake. It does gather a lot of tourists each year, though. They come here to scuba dive and see the remains of some of the ships that still lie here. The bottom of this lake even contains what's left of the notorious SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Back when it departed on June 7, 1958, It was the largest ship on North America's Great Lakes and, to this day, remains the largest ship ever to have sunk in the area. Similar to other events, the exact cause of the shipwreck remains a mystery.
The moon shines brightly and illuminates the black water of the ocean. Thick fog descends on it in ominous silence. Then, it's suddenly broken by the creaking of wooden boards, followed by a rippling of the waves. Through the fog, you see the outline of an old, large ship. Its hull is rusty, and a strange cold is coming from it. But the most unsettling thing is that there's no one on the deck. The ship sails without a crew. No, this isn't a mythical Flying Dutchman, but a very real ghost ship. September 2nd, 2019. The British Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, called the HMS Protector, sails through the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The time is 11 p.m. Some of the ship's crew are on deck, while others are sleeping in their cabins. The captain steers the ship and looks straight at the horizon. The sky is lit up by an orange twilight, and clouds float in the distance. Suddenly, against this beautiful landscape, one of the sailors notices the black silhouette of an unknown ship. The captain slows down and steers the ship a little closer to the mysterious vessel. This is an old cargo ship, 250 feet long. Attempts to contact the crew members lead to nothing. It seems the unknown boat is floating in the ocean by itself. There's no one on board, at least, no one alive. The deck of the ship creaks from rocking on the waves. The sun sinks below the horizon, and it gets dark. The ship looks terrifying. British sailors don't dare to climb on that strange deck. They take a photo, post it on the internet, and sail away. Many people on the internet will assume the sailors met a real ghost ship. 5 months later, we're in the village of Ballycotton in County Cork, Ireland. A local leaves the house early in the morning to go for a daily run. Music in his headphones, fresh cool air, and a scenic route are ideal conditions for a good workout. The jogger runs along the road on the coast of the Celtic Sea. There was a strong storm last night, and now the sea looks calm. The man runs along the top of a low cliff and notices a huge vessel. An old rusty cargo ship 250 feet long lies on the beach, right among the rocks. No people on board. It seems the ship has been here for ages, but the local is sure this vessel wasn't here yesterday. A little later, it turns out this is the same ship that the sailors from the HMS Protector saw 5 months ago, thousands of miles from this place. The cargo ship, called the Alta, was built in 1976. Nobody knows who used it all this time and for what purposes. It's only known that in 2017, the ship was purchased by a new owner and marked with the flag of Tanzania. It's important to say that almost all cargo ships are equipped with AIS, Automatic Identification System, which is needed to track ship movements in the ocean. Since 2015, something strange started happening with the Alta's AIS. The ship disappeared from the satellites, then reappeared again. Over the past few years, this ship had changed several names and flags. It's not surprising that its AIS shut off and turned on numerous times. It's said that some of those who disable AIS on their ships do so to hide outlaw activities. The ship's captain, whoever it was, clearly didn't want to show the Alta's movements. As AIS showed in 2017, the ship had sailed near Greek port cities. The Alta made 12 stops in 3 such cities in different parts of Greece. Then, the AIS signal disappeared, and 10 months later, the Alta reappeared near the northern coast of Africa, 1,200 miles from Greece. In September of 2018, the ship was sailing about 1,400 miles southeast of Bermuda, and at that time, the crew members started having problems. There were 10 people on board the Alta. On September 19th, the ship's engine failed right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The nearest shore was very far away. The the ship began to drift. As days passed, the crew couldn't fix the vessel. Food supplies were running low. The crew started to panic and tried to contact someone. The situation got worse as a strong hurricane was approaching the place where the ship broke down. Crew members contacted the U.S. Coast Guard. On October 2nd, a helicopter headed towards the ship. Food and water were unloaded on the Alta. This was enough for the crew to bide their time for several days. About a week later, a rescue boat sailed about 1,500 miles to reach the Alta and help the stranded sailors. Shortly before the start of the hurricane, American rescuers succeeded. The entire crew of the wrecked ship was taken to Puerto Rico. The Alta remained drifting in the ocean. After a while, another ship arrived to tow it to the coast of Guyana. Then, something went wrong again. The ship was hijacked. Who did it and why remains a mystery to this day. But then, for some unknown reason, the thieves decided to abandon the ship and left it to drift in the ocean. For almost a year, the ship's location couldn't be tracked. Then, in September 2019, the vessel was found by the British Royal Navy. How the Alta was able to cover the distance across the Atlantic and wash up on the coast of Ireland is unknown. An investigation has been launched in Ireland. It's necessary to identify the owner of the vessel and find a responsible person to take on the task of towing it. But no one has since been found. Once, an unknown person called the Irish authorities and introduced themselves as the owner of the ship, but didn't provide any evidence. Several barrels of oil were found on board the Alta. To dismantle the ship, the Irish authorities will need to spend about 10 million euros. Local residents are annoyed by the wreck too. Corroding metal is bad for the environment, and kids have already snuck on board and posted a video on the internet from inside the abandoned ship. The further fate of the Alta remains unresolved. It's still lying there. That ship sailed in the ocean for just 2 years. Now imagine if some other managed to drift for 38. In all that time, no one could catch this ship, and people still seek it. That vessel is called the SS Bechimo. It was a merchant ship owned by a Canadian trading company. In 1931, the ship got stuck in ice off the coast of Alaska. A strong snowstorm began. The team waited a week for it to end, but the storm only intensified. One day, the weather improved a bit, and part of the team was evacuated to the nearest city. Another part of the crew, with the captain, set up camp near the ship. The storm started again and didn't stop for a long time. The blizzard was so heavy that the ship's captain couldn't see beyond his arm's reach. Finally, when the storm was over, the captain saw that the ship simply vanished. He decided the Bechimo sank during the storm. A week later, the ship was found, drifting near the place where it was lost. The hull of the ship was damaged so badly that it was unsafe to sail on it. The captain decided to abandon the ship. However, it didn't sink. For the next 38 years, it was drifting at various points along the Alaskan coast. Several times, people climbed on the ship, including native Alaskan residents and a group of researchers. Attempts to save the vessel from the sea ended in failure. The salvage operations were hampered by drifting ice and bad weather. The last time it was seen was in 1969. The ship was frozen and blocked by the ice. In 2006, the government created a special project to find the Bechimo. However, in all these years, the ship still hasn't been found. Its fate is unknown. It's likely that the ship has finally found peace and is now lying on the seabed of the Chukchi Sea.
You've probably seen Hollywood movies where somehow a small hole opens up in the side of a plane and then immediately it's utter chaos. Food trays and bags flying, seatbelts barely holding passengers in place. Luckily, in reality, small damage to the fuselage won't cause such dramatic consequences. But would you believe me if I told you there was a pilot that managed to land a plane with half the roof torn completely off? Buckle up. At 1:25 p.m. on April 28, 1988, a 19-year-old Boeing 737 that belonged to Aloha Airlines left Hilo International Airport and headed for Honolulu. The plane was named after Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last sovereign monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii. On that day, the aircraft already had 3 short flights from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Apologies to the people of Hawaii for any mispronounced names. Anyway, all the trips were regular and uneventful. The weather was calm, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. The captain was experienced pilot Robert Schornsteimer, 44 years old, who had 6,700 flight hours in the Boeing 737. The first officer was Madeline Tompkins, 36 years old, who had flown more than 3,500 hours in the very same Boeing model. Early in the morning, still in Honolulu, the first officer had conducted the regular pre-flight inspection and announced that the plane was ready for the flight. At 11 a.m., the plane left Honolulu and headed for Maui and then to Hilo. When the plane arrived at the destination, the pilots didn't leave the cockpit or inspect the aircraft from the outside. After all, it wasn't a requirement, so they didn't have to. Following schedule, the plane started the last leg on the routine round trip at 1:25 p.m. There were 95 people on board the aircraft, 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who stayed in the observer seat in the cockpit. After a normal takeoff and ascent, the plane got to the usual cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, and then, at about 1:48 p.m., 26 miles away from Kaului, the unexpected happened. Those who were in the cockpit heard a loud whooshing sound and then a crack, followed by the deafening sound of wind seconds later. Apparently, a small part of the roof on the left side tore loose, which led to the explosive decompression of the plane. But the worst thing was that the decompression caused a ripple effect, which led to a huge section of the airplane's roof to tear off completely. The length of the missing part was 18.5 feet long. It was all part of the aircraft's skin that covered the plane from the cockpit back to the forewing area. At first, the pilots didn't realize what had happened. The first officer, who was in control of the aircraft at that moment, felt her head jerk backward, and she noticed debris and gray pieces of insulation flying chaotically around the cockpit. When the captain turned his head, he saw that the cockpit door had disappeared, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring at a clear blue sky. The plane started to roll from side to side, and it was becoming increasingly harder to control. Everybody who was in the cockpit immediately put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over the aircraft. He prodded the speed brakes into action and began an emergency descent towards the nearest airport, which was on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were in their seats at the moment when the accident happened, and since the seatbelt sight was still on, everyone had their seatbelts fastened. However, all 3 flight attendants were standing along the aircraft aisle. The one who was the closest to the front of the plane was swept out through the hole in the roof. The other 2 were thrown to the floor by a forceful jerk. But while one of them hit her head really hard and lost consciousness, the other one started to crawl along the aisle in an attempt to help passengers and calm them down. At that same time, the pilots were trying to contact air traffic control and signal an emergency. To make matters worse, they couldn't hear each other and had to use gestures to communicate. They also didn't know whether the radio worked and whether they had managed to deliver their message. The flight controls were sluggish and loose, and the captain was struggling to control the plane. The first officer, right by his side, dealing with communication and assisting the captain. It turned out that the controller hadn't been receiving the crew's messages until the aircraft descended to the altitude of 14,000 feet. Only then did the signal get through, and Maui Tower started urgent preparations for an emergency landing. The problem was that at that time, in case of an emergency, the airport control tower had to dial 911 just like anyone else. On top of that, the controller didn't catch that the passengers and crew members would need medical help. After all, the crew only announced that they had experienced a rapid decompression, so the controller wasn't aware of the entire gravity of the situation. In the meantime, the plane had already dropped to a height of 10,000 feet above sea level. The captain removed his oxygen mask and withdrew the speed brakes. The plane was steadily descending toward runway 2 of Kaului Airport. Following the captain's command, the first officer lowered the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't come on. That could mean that either they had a bad light, or they had serious problems with the nose gear. But that wasn't the only problem. As the plane was approaching the runway, the left engine failed, and the aircraft started rocking and shaking. The captain made an attempt to restart the engine, but didn't succeed. And yet, still, with the help of the reverse thrust of the second, still working engine, at 1:58 p.m., just 10 minutes after the emergency and 35 minutes after the takeoff, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 did manage to touch down on the runway of Kahului Airport and come to a complete stop. Landing a plane with such a huge loss of integrity was an unprecedented feat. As soon as the plane stopped, the evacuation began. Everyone on the plane, except for the one flight attendant who had been pulled out of the plane, was alive, although 65 people were injured. Most people had been hurt by flying debris and torn pieces of fuselage. Unfortunately, since nobody on the ground had known how serious the situation was, no ambulances were waiting for the injured. The first one arrived 7 minutes after the plane landed, and there were only 2 ambulances on the entire island, which obviously couldn't fit all the people. That's why the passengers had to be transported to the hospital in several 15-passenger tour vans that belonged to the company Akamai Tours. Luckily, 2 Akamai drivers used to be paramedics, so they started to tend to the injured right on the runway. Meanwhile, airport mechanics, as well as office staff, drove the vans to the hospital, which was 3 miles away. Luckily, there were only 8 serious injuries, from which all of these passengers later recovered. As for the plane, it was damaged beyond repair and later dismantled right at the airport. The missing part of the roof disappeared and was never seen again. But what could cause such a terrible accident? The problem wasn't the age of the aircraft. 19 years isn't that old for a commercial plane, and it hadn't accumulated too many flight hours before the accident happened. But the 35,500 flight hours the plane had traveled included 89,680 takeoffs and landings, which are also called flight cycles. The reason for such a huge number was that the plane performed mostly short domestic flights between the islands. And this number exceeded the number of flight cycles the plane was designed for twice over. Besides, the plane traveled in a salty and humid environment, which also added to the wear and tear. Interestingly, during one interview that followed the accident, passenger Gail Yamamoto remembered that she had spotted a crack in the fuselage when she was boarding. Unfortunately, she was the only one who had seen the damage, and the woman hadn't thought that the crack was important enough to inform the crew. It's important to stress that these kinds of accidents are extremely rare these days. According to Harvard University, given all the steps and measures major airlines and airports take to ensure safety, the odds of you being in an airplane accident is roughly 1 in 1.2 million. That's a 0.0000083% chance. I don't know about you, but I like those odds. And even if something were to happen, like, for example, half the roof falling off, it's a great comfort to know that your trained pilots can still land the plane relatively safely.
There are so many ways to make airplanes safer. For example, they could have ejector seats so that every passenger could be rescued. In reality, though, it's way more difficult than it sounds. If there were ejector seats, your trip would be very different. Everyone would have to be strapped into a seat with a harness to make sure they wouldn't fall out of it. Then you would have to wear an oxygen mask all throughout the flight. An emergency can occur at any time. Then, ejection in itself is a big pressure on your body. Even fighter pilots who are physically prepared can still suffer severe injuries. For an average person, this process wouldn't be safe. So, however cool it sounds, ejection seats aren't very practical and are actually quite dangerous. Okay, well, at least they could have a parachute for each passenger. But this wouldn't be very useful either. Parachutes only sound like they can save many lives. First, having them isn't efficient. They're very costly and heavy. So a plane would need to burn more fuel while flying if there were parachutes on board. It would all be worth it, though, if parachutes could make an actual difference to the safety of people, but they can't. Commercial planes aren't designed in a way that would make it safe to jump out of them, especially with a couple hundred people on board. Next, passengers aren't trained to use them. Imagine there's an emergency. The plane is falling, and 200 people are trying to deal with a parachute for the first time in their lives. It would be an absolute mess. Lastly, it's not safe to jump from the high altitudes planes fly at. So, oxygen masks, life vests, and boats are the best life-saving equipment, and every plane has those. You know those huge engines that they have under the wings? Yeah, look at them. They don't look safe at all. Birds can get pulled in, and it actually happens. They could at least put a grate in front of the rotating parts to prevent birds from getting in there. Turns out those engines pull inside huge amounts of air, and this is crucial for them to work properly. The more air gets swallowed, the more air gets compressed, mixed with fuel, and burned. And then, more of it gets pushed out from the other side, keeping the plane going. A cover at the front would be a barrier, significantly reducing the air inflow that is crucial for the proper work of the engines, and this would endanger the passengers. But hey, don't be too upset. Birds fly way lower than planes do, so they're only in danger for a few minutes at the beginning of the flight while the plane is climbing altitude, and at the very end when the plane is landing. So very few of them ever get pulled in, and if they do, it's never a threat to the engines or passenger safety. Planes also don't change up the gears like cars do, so technically they can't go backwards. The reason for this is that planes don't need to go backward. They can just turn around and move in the opposite direction, but face first. The only time when they need to move backward is when they have to get to the gate. And for those times, there's help. Pushback tractors. Those are small vehicles that can connect to airplanes and move them in the required direction. Watch out for those next time you fly. But technically speaking, planes can go backward if the engines start pushing the air forward instead of backward. But this is very dangerous for everyone around. One of the very few cases when they do it is during landing, to help slow the airplane down. There are cameras on the outside that let pilots navigate taxiways better. They come in especially handy during tricky maneuvering. But do you know there are also cameras in airplane cabins? You can relax, there are no cameras in the lavatories. But yes, they are there in the cabin, and for security reasons only. Flight attendants monitor them to see what's not visible from their own seats. Of course, flight attendants can check everything just by walking down the cabin, and that's exactly what they do most of the time. So, cameras are mostly used during takeoff and landing, when everyone, including flight attendants, is supposed to sit down, as those are the most dangerous stages of a flight. Notice that it's exactly during these stages that the rules are particularly strict. All electronic devices should be turned off or put on airplane mode, and big electronic devices should be stored away. Window blinds should be raised and tables folded. Seats should be put in the upright position. You need to have your seatbelt fastened, and so on. This is all done for safety and to ensure fast evacuation in case of emergency. So let's discuss these rules. Airplane mode on electronic devices is important to make sure that the signals that devices transmit don't interfere with the plane's electronic systems. If they interfere, they will block the radio's frequency pilots need to get their instructions. Do you remember that clicking sound a speaker makes right before your cell phone gets a call if the two devices are close? This is the sound pilots might hear while communicating with air traffic control. Now, putting away large devices like laptops is important because they might turn into obstacles if you need to get out of the plane fast in case of an emergency. All the pathways should be as clear as possible. This is why everything should be packed away, seats straightened, and tables folded. There should be nothing blocking anyone's way. And lastly, window blinds. The lights on the airplane get turned off too. Those two things are done to make sure your eyes get used to the natural light outside the aircraft. Imagine it's night, some emergency happens, and the lights that were left on suddenly go off. People need to evacuate as fast as possible, but their eyes aren't adjusted to the dark yet, and they can't see anything. This will slow everyone down. If the lights inside are out, people get used to the darkness and will be able to evacuate faster. The same goes for window blinds. If it's day and they are raised, people are used to the light outside and can evacuate faster. Another reason is that when blinds are raised during landing, people outside can see what's going on inside the plane. For example, if there's fire or smoke and where exactly. This way, they can plan the evacuation process better. Also, you might have noticed black triangles drawn above some windows on the airplane. These triangles mark the seats from which the view on the airplane's wings is the best. It's needed for the crew to find the spot as fast as possible if, in case of emergency, they need to inspect the engines, slats, or flaps. This little triangle saves the plane crew a lot of time. We do talk about emergencies a lot, but they really don't happen often. It's more dangerous to drive a car than to fly by plane, and most of us get in the car every day. Yet, the fear of flying is still very much out there, and people can get superstitious. In many cultures, the number 13 is considered unlucky. So, airplane companies that often fly to those destinations just omit row 13. It's a small thing to do, but it can spare a few anxious passengers who happen to sit in row 13. In other cultures, like in Italy and Brazil, 17 is the unlucky number, and some aircraft have both rows 13 and 17 missing. In airplanes that fly to China, they can often omit row 14 instead.
A lot of airports are built near water, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. First off, most airports are located in big cities, and big cities are usually built near some form of water anyway. Back in the day, before trucks and proper roads were built, goods were transported by ship. Having a river or ocean nearby was vital to deliver essential supplies to the cities, like food and building supplies. It also allowed for trading to boost the local economies. Because most people travel into big cities for business and holidays, rather than rural areas, it made sense to build the airports there. The high demand for travel meant that the airports were needed and also made them profitable. But that's not the only reason they're built near water. Big cities are usually super crowded, and airports require a lot of land. Imagine trying to find a space big enough in the middle of New York City to put an airport. It would be basically impossible. Areas next to water are usually a bit more rural, so there's more space than the big cities filled with skyscrapers. Some countries have even taken this one step further. Land is really scarce in Japan, so to build Kansai International Airport, the architects of Osaka headed 3 miles offshore to Osaka Bay to make a man-made island. The artificial island is 13,200 feet long and 8,500 feet wide. That's so big that it can even be seen from space. It took a whopping 38 months to complete, and travelers can get across to the main island of Honshu via car, railroad, or high-speed ferry. Kansai International Airport opened in 1994 and became the world's first airport to be built on the sea. Despite its location, it has the longest airport terminal in the world with a length of just under 1 mile. Airplanes also can't have any obstacles around them when landing. It would be really difficult to try landing a plane with obstructions. These include trees, mountains, buildings, and power lines. Over water, nothing will restrict planes from taking off or landing, making it much safer. On mountainous islands, runways are often parallel to the ocean, as the mountains are inland, just like in the Gran Canaria Airport located on one of the Canary Islands. It also links to safety reasons. If a plane has to cancel a runway landing and go back around again, there must be enough room for it to do this safely without hitting anything. It's also got to be able to climb back up into the air at a safe angle to avoid causing problems for the passengers inside. Reaching this safe altitude is much easier, quicker, and safer by the sea, compared to big cities or mountainous areas. Speaking of failed landings, pilots are trained to deal with engine failure on takeoff. If a plane reaches the right speed for takeoff, it has to leave the runway, even if the engine fails. But don't worry, planes can still fly with only one engine. It just requires a bit more effort. Because of the reduced capacity, it takes longer to reach the right altitude, and more space is required for takeoff. Taking off towards the ocean makes it easier to climb to a safe altitude without worrying about colliding with any obstacles. Another reason for airports being built at water level is that the higher up we go, the thinner the air becomes. It causes the thrust of the engines to decrease, as well as the lift produced by the wings. Setting off from higher areas means it's more difficult for the planes to take off. In terms of money, this would mean building longer runways, which would cost more, and no one wants that. This also means the planes require less fuel as they don't burn as much energy on takeoff, and there's less noise made as the planes don't have to work as hard. But despite this making the planes less noisy, airports are going to have pretty high noise levels. Imagine hearing planes zooming over your house while you're trying to get sleep at night. This is a key reason why airports are usually built on the coast, far away from any residential areas, as fish aren't generally known to file noise complaints. In some countries, airports actually have to provide upgrades for nearby houses that will be affected by the noise. Germany is one of these countries, and they do everything from improving roofs to adding wall insulation to cover all that noise. Building by the coast means that they don't have to pay up for all these expensive upgrades, which saves the airport lots of cash. Coastal areas also have weather advantages for flying. Sea breezes are steady winds that blow from the water to the land. Planes mostly land and take off with the wind, making it the perfect place to build an airport as there'll be no delays caused by unexpected strong winds. But while the sea breezes that come in spring and summer are great, areas near water can be prone to fog during fall and winter, so this part has its pros and cons. But not every airport is on the coast, as it does also pose a number of issues too. One of the biggest is birds. Our feathered friends love the coast because of all the yummy fish, but they can cause big problems for pilots. But airports manage to get around this using scare tactics. Birds don't really enjoy noise, and planes aren't the quietest of things. Airports also make loud bangs and even train hawks to take down birds that are in the way. The most obvious risk of building close to the sea, though, is flooding. Airports cost crazy amounts of money to build, and planes aren't cheap either. Back in 2018, Kansai Airport was flooded by Typhoon Jebi. They had to cancel all operations for 2 days, and the water was so high that it damaged the engines of the planes. While coastal airports put measures in place to protect against flooding, it's pretty difficult to save everything from a typhoon. With rising sea levels and an increase in extreme weather, these floodings are also looking more and more likely to happen. A quarter of the world's 100 busiest airports are less than 32 feet above sea level, and 12 of those, including New York, San Francisco, and Shanghai, are less than 16 feet. Yikes! All that water poses another problem. If planes overshoot the runway, they have nowhere to go. Overshooting is basically when the pilot underestimates the length of the runway and doesn't reach takeoff speed in time. There are usually extra bits of concrete or grass that the plane can run onto when the airports are on land. There'd be a bit of damage to the plane in this case, but nothing major. But with coastal airports, the plane might go straight into the water. Luckily, there's new tech that aims to prevent this from happening. These new kits let the pilots enter in all the flight calculations, including the weather conditions that could affect takeoff. This system then calculates how much runway the plane will need to stop. Many airports also have added soft concrete to the end of runways to avoid a watery disaster. When the plane glides onto this soft concrete, they get stuck and it stops them traveling too far. There are also financial issues with building airports next to the water. Land rent next to the coast or lakes is usually higher than the mainland due to the demand. Like 40% of the US population lives on the coast, despite coastal areas only making up around 10% of America's total landmass. Airports require flat land to be built on, but this isn't always easy to find, and coastal land can pose particular problems due to sand conditions on marshland. But this doesn't mean it's not possible. One of the world's most famous airports, New York's JFK, was built on marshland. The land was a lot cheaper than usual, and marshland can't really be used for a lot. Of course, it can cost a lot of money to make the ground suitable to carry heavy loads, but this was all sorted. Finding such a big area close to one of the world's most famous cities was a very rare find, even if it was marshland.
The Himalayas have some of the highest peaks in the world, including Mount Everest. But it's no surprise airplanes find it difficult to navigate the area. But why are commercial airplanes actually banned from flying there?
Roger, Flight 80
For starters, these mountains have an average height of more than 20,000 feet. Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the entire world, stands at 29,037 feet high above sea level. The area is rough, filled with snow, and has almost no flat surfaces. In case of sudden cabin depressurization, it would be really difficult to perform an emergency landing, since there's literally no flat area there. More so, the low oxygen environment at such an altitude means there's likely to be a lot of turbulence. Not only is it really unpleasant for passengers, but random air movements and high wind velocity means that it's really difficult to maneuver the airplane. This area is also quite low populated, so there's not much there in terms of radar systems. And radar is crucial for aviation safety. Without radars, pilots would be unable to communicate with the ground to figure out flight conditions. It can also get so cold up there that jet fuel might completely freeze. Sure, the fuels used in airplanes usually freeze at around -50 degrees Fahrenheit, but it may be possible above Everest. The lowest temperature was recorded there back in December 2004, when thermometers showed a staggering -44 degrees Fahrenheit. So, no wonder pilots don't want to ever take that risk, especially on a commercial flight. Among the few airports located in the Himalayas, there's one considered to be the most challenging to land in the world. Only 8 pilots on the planet are certified to do it. It's called Paro International Airport, and it's located in Bhutan, a landlocked country in the eastern Himalayas. First, landing there is so dangerous because you're literally flying through some of the world's tallest mountain peaks. Not to mention that those 8 pilots also have to consider strong winds. Despite the challenges, they do manage to safely land over 30,000 people each year. Moving further, there's no radar there to guide the pilots, so they need to maneuver the aircraft entirely in manual mode. The pilots need to track their movements based on specific visual landmark checkpoints as they approach the runway. Moreover, flights are only allowed there during daylight hours and under good visibility. These pilots also need to watch out for utility poles and roofs on the hillsides too. It means they often squeeze their planes between mountain peaks at 45-degree angles before dropping quickly onto the runway. No wonder only 2 airlines fly to Paro International Airport. Apart from these commercial pilots, there are specially trained helicopter rescue pilots who spend most of their career at 20,000 feet in the sky. Most of the time, they partner with equally experienced climbers who train by crossing the Khumbu Icefall. It's dubbed the most dangerous square mile on the planet. Made up of ice pillars as tall as a 6-story building, this huge stretch of the glacier on Everest's western side is filled with bottomless ice holes. It takes between 4 to 12 hours to get from one edge of the icefall to the other, depending on the experience of the climber. You may think it's a pretty serene location since you're literally only surrounded by ice and snow, but these local professionals claim otherwise. One Everest veteran said that the noise was actually the worst part of the job. The mountain produces awful squeaking sounds and sometimes even sighs. It often makes people feel like it's talking to them, warning them about the treacherous environment. Mount Everest isn't the only no-fly zone in the world. Surprisingly, Disney parks are also part of this exclusive club. So you won't ever be able to look out of your plane window and see the beauty of fairy tale castles from up above. In recent years, a lot of crowded tourist attractions, including Disney parks, have increased their security measures to make sure their visitors are as safe as possible. As such, no aircraft is allowed to fly within 3,000 feet of Disneyland in California or Walt Disney World in Florida. It was initially a temporary ban, but this rule became permanent back in 2003. Some other places don't have planes flying over them because of their historical importance, like Machu Picchu, located in the Peruvian Andes Mountains. There's also a large number of rare wildlife species and plants that grow exclusively in this area. It's crucial that they're protected as well as possible. What does it have to do with planes not flying over that area? Firstly, it reduces the volume of harmful chemicals in the area. Secondly, if a plane ever needed to perform an emergency landing in this location, it'd cause irreversible damage to buildings and wildlife. Surprisingly, planes can fly over the Greek Parthenon in Athens, but with one condition: not to get closer than 5,000 feet above it. This way, the historical building is kept a bit more protected from any emergency landings, since there are specially designated areas around it. You won't be able to see the Taj Mahal from above either, since it's one of the most important, oldest, and most beautiful pieces of architecture in the world. It also needs added security features. This building dates back to the 1600s. UNESCO announced it a World Heritage Site in 1983. The Indian authorities set up a no-fly zone above it in 2006. They did it to safeguard not only the building itself, but also the crowds of tourists that come there each year, 7 to 8 million people. Buckingham Palace is well known for being the residence of British monarchs. So, for the Queen's security, a no-fly zone was set up here too. Planes aren't allowed to fly over Windsor Castle either, to make sure the royal family is equally protected. Other important British buildings with no-fly zones include Number 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister's official residence and office, and the Houses of Parliament. George Washington's home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, can only have planes flying above it at more than 1,500 feet. The historical wooden mansion was built for President George Washington between 1758 and 1778. Unfortunately, the building has seen a lot of damage over the years, so in an effort to preserve it better, authorities decided to prohibit vibrations produced by flying aircraft. That's why another no-fly zone was established there. It covers the airspace above this National Historic Landmark. That's probably the reason why you'll rarely see pictures of this house from above. Since it's the residence of the US President, it's not allowed to fly over Washington, D.C. It's also the home of Congress and other establishments. So, the authorities set a special flight rules area, stretching for 30 miles around Ronald Reagan International Airport. This means that it's one of the airports with the most precise takeoffs and landings. Pilots have to carefully tackle no-fly zones, which sometimes results in uncomfortable takeoffs for passengers. Whenever a pilot breaks a no-fly zone, it's a big problem, like the one that happened back in 2005, when a pilot accidentally steered the plane into a prohibited zone. The capital had to be evacuated immediately, and their regular activities were interrupted. Other capitals of the world have similar requirements, like Budapest, for example. In the capital city of Hungary, planes aren't allowed to fly over the ancient inner city of Pest and the Buda Hills. Almost all air traffic is generally prohibited above Paris too, with some exceptions. Aircrafts flying no lower than 6,500 feet. Flying helicopters are also a big no-no within the city limits. Only certain choppers undertaking precise missions can get special authorization. Generally, passenger planes aren't allowed near the island of Manhattan either, partly because of the really tall buildings there and the added risk of collision, but mostly because all three major New York airports, John F. Kennedy International Airport, Newark Liberty International Airport, and LaGuardia Airport are very close to each other, so the air traffic in the area has to be really well thought out to make sure the planes don't cross paths. At the beginning of the 20th century, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, a German steamship was leaving the port. Suddenly, the weather got worse, and the vessel entered a thick fog. The sailors ran aground on a sandbank close to the shore. Luckily, no one was hurt, and they were even able to save their precious cargo. But the ship was stuck in the sand for good. And it was not alone there. Nearly the entire length of the western coast of Namibia is called Skeleton Coast. If the name sounds scary, that's because it is. This 976-mile-long beach line is among the most dangerous places on Earth. The local Bushman tribes believe that their supreme deity made this land when it was angry. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to set foot in Namibia in the 15th century. And yep, they didn't like Skeleton Coast either. Portuguese explorers thought this land presented the gates to the underworld. This is the place where the Namib Desert meets the Atlantic Ocean. It might be dangerous, but it's actually beautiful. Plus, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If Skeleton Coast had a PR manager, they would quit on the first day on the job. The area is not exactly tourist-friendly because of its geography and history. Beneath the sand and the waves, there is a secret ocean currently lurking for unsuspecting sailors. It's called Benguela Current. It flows towards the north along the coast of southern Africa. This part of the Atlantic is rich in marine life, but the current's land neighbor isn't that happy with the deal. This arid climate created the Namib Desert, one of the driest regions on Earth. And that marine life I just mentioned? It's sharks. 11 species of them to be exact. And yes, the great white decides to pop by once in a while. So far, we've got a desert landscape, strong currents, and sharks. Not a place for a beachside resort, definitely. But if someone ends up on Skeleton Coast, will they know they're in danger? Don't worry, they will. The beach is littered with wrecks of all sizes and shapes. If you remember that German ship I mentioned in the very beginning, its massive and rusted stern is now sticking out from the desert sand. There are some 500 wrecks in total scattered along the coast, and it's a mixed crowd, from Portuguese galleons centuries old to ships that ran ashore here in the 21st century. A modern fishing ship called Zela India managed to slip from its tow rope in 2008 and ended up on Skeleton Coast. Okay, it didn't escape on its own, it had some help from the elements. But it's better to be a tourist attraction on a beach than to be broken up for scrap. That's where the trawler was originally going, poor thing. Skeleton Coast's most famous inhabitant, to call it such a place, is the wreck of the Dunedin Star. The British cargo liner ran aground here in 1942. The massive rescue operation that followed reveals why it's so dangerous for sailors to end up here. The rescuers managed to save all of the crew and passengers, but at a heavy price. An aircraft and a tugboat were lost in the process. It took the last of the rescuers a full 2 months to return home to Cape Town. Why, you might wonder? One look at the map of the region reveals the reason. It's an endless sea of yellow, which is the sand. There are so few roads here, so Skeleton Coast is hard to reach by land. There are also legal obstacles. You need a special permit to drive into the area. But the skeletons in the name of the area don't only refer to ships, they also stand for animal bones. Most of these belong to whales and seals. Many animals have adapted to the area, so lions and hyenas roam the coastline in search of a meal. Yeah, now there are hungry lions as well, as if those sharks weren't enough. Other animals with a temporary residence on Skeleton Coast include elephants, cheetahs, leopards, and giraffes. In 1971, the Namibian authorities established a national park here, but except for surfers, after an adrenaline rush, they don't get many visitors. You can understand why. The Namib Desert is the oldest desert in the world, and it's not very tourist-friendly either. Those who travel to the region should pack sunscreen and a warm winter jacket. A weird combo, right? Well, not so much when you think that during the day, temperatures soar over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, the air temperature drops below freezing. What a climate roller coaster! And that's not the final danger. Yep, there's more. Remember how that German ship got lost in thick fog? Yeah, it wasn't a one-off event. Because of the region's climate, fog shows up frequently. Sailors should cover their ears now, but this fog is actually good for wildlife. This is their only source of water in the Namib Desert. Reptiles and mammals have adapted to the harsh climate. They use as little water as possible. Shifting sands, thick fog, strong currents, lions, and sharks. Not the stuff you would put in a tourist booklet, but Skeleton Coast isn't the only beach on Earth you wouldn't want to spend your vacation on. I will take you to Cape Tribulation in Australia. The area covers some 48 square miles in the northwestern part of the continent. And no, the area is not as dry as Skeleton Coast. It's part of the Daintree rainforest. You could say that here, it is the rainforest, not the desert that meets the ocean. The beach at Cape Tribulation is straight from a postcard. But looks can be deceiving. Australia? Probably sharks. No, crocodiles are out here to get you if you decide to go for a dip in the sea. There are saltwater crocodiles that the locals call salties. Well, that's a cute nickname for such a dangerous reptile. And it's not just that. The wildlife seems to have a beef with visitors. From October to June, the waters around Cape Tribulation are full of box jellyfish. Their venom affects the human cardiovascular system. When touched by a jellyfish out at sea, swimmers won't have enough time to reach land for help. Vinegar helps neutralize the sting, so you might want to keep a spare bottle in your luggage. Crocodiles and jellyfish sound dangerous, but there's one more animal you should look after. It's the wild boar. It might sound funny, but you won't laugh when you're being chased by one of these across the beach. 21 million wild boars live in Australia. They're mostly active at night, making it even more dangerous if they charge at you. The best defense is running in circles. Wild boars can't cut corners well. That's probably why we don't see many of them taking up careers as race drivers. Cape Tribulation has one last danger installed for you, and it's not an animal. Out here, even the trees are plotting against visitors. The stinging tree got its name for a reason. If you try to pick one of its beautiful red berries, it'll fight back. Its prickles are like tiny glass shards. The less than pleasant effect on your skin will last for a month. Then there is this wait a while bush. Who keeps naming them like this? This long vine has spikes that grab hold and just don't let go. They are so strong they can pull a human off a horse. You'll have to wait for someone to come by and save you from this thorny grabber. If you are about to cross this Australian beach from the vacation list, hold on for a second. Tourism is booming here. The local authorities have restricted access to all of the danger zones. Visitors go swimming in dreamy water holes that are surrounded by lush vegetation. There are even ropes to swing from. Now, that's a beach you can finally relax on.
The voyage started just like any other. The cargo ship SS Cotopaxi is making another journey to Havana, Cuba, to deliver coal. It's November 29, 1925. For Captain Meyer and his crew, leaving Charleston Port, South Carolina, it will be the last trip the ship ever makes. Its route ran through the Bermuda Triangle. 2 days into the trip, the Cotopaxi sent out a distress signal. It had got caught up in a strong tropical storm and turned over on its side. The wind was very strong and there was powerful lightning as well. Rain gradually filled the ship's hold. Then there was a bright white flash, and the ship disappeared without a trace. Later, its wreckage was found in the Gobi Desert, which is in a completely different part of the world. All 32 crew members, including the captain, were missing. Of course, the part about the Gobi Desert is fictional. For one of his movies, Steven Spielberg came up with the idea that the ship was moved there by aliens. Still, in real life, the ship was never found, and its crew really did disappear. It was officially declared missing a month afterward, and nobody could find the wreck. It seems like a classic case of mysterious things going on in the Bermuda Triangle. But most mysteries are solved sooner or later. In 2020, the Cotopaxi was found. A man named Michael Barnett had moved to Florida to study shipwrecks off the coast. One wreck in particular really caught his attention. It was much larger than the others, and the locals called it the Bear Wreck. It was about 40 miles from St. Augustine in northern Florida, but no one had ever managed to identify the rusty hull. So Michael started to do some detective work. He measured the size of the shipwreck and started working through all the information he could find. He researched hundreds of old newspapers, leafed through insurance records, and looked at artifacts found on the wreck. After hundreds of hours of hard work, Michael was sure it was the Cotopaxi. But a few years before, there had been a rumor that the same ship had been found off the coast of Cuba. The Coast Guard found the wreck of a cargo ship about the same size that looked a lot like the one lost in 1925. Michael was sure they were wrong, so he teamed up with some science journalists and kept investigating. Soon they discovered something that seemed to confirm Michael's belief. Divers found brass valves with the letters SV on them in the wreckage of the ship. Michael suggested these initials referred to Scott Valve Manufacturing Company. The headquarters of this company was in Michigan, not far from where the Cotopaxi had been built. The company had probably supplied parts for the Cotopaxi. So the puzzle seemed to be solved. The Bear Wreck was really the missing cargo ship. But Michael still needed to work out why the ship had sunk. Did something mysterious really happen to the Cotopaxi in the Bermuda Triangle? Later, Michael found the testimony of the ship's carpenter among some old papers. The carpenter claimed that the hatches covering the coal on the ship had been in a terrible condition before it sank. Repair work on the covers wasn't finished before the crew got the order to sail to Cuba. So if the hatch covers were still broken during the trip, water could have easily gotten on board. This water probably flooded the hold during the tropical storm. This was the real reason why the Cotopaxi went down. There was really nothing mysterious about it. It was just a mistake made by ordinary people. But this is just one example out of dozens, or even hundreds, where ships and planes have gone missing in the Bermuda Triangle. We still can't explain some of these incidents. It seems like there really is something weird going on there. One of these strange events happened in 1948. A passenger jet was headed for Miami from San Juan, Puerto Rico. It disappeared in the same area as the Cotopaxi. The 32 people on board vanished without a trace. The weather was clear throughout the flight, but experts think that when the plane was about 50 miles from the coast, it could have been hit by a strong wind that knocked it off course. Years later, a similar plane was found in the area of the Bermuda Triangle, but because no one could work out the registration, it was impossible to say for sure if it was the same one. Something even stranger occurred not long before, in 1945. 5 planes went missing all at the same time. Some trainee pilots were practicing their navigation skills, but when they'd finished, it seems they couldn't find their way back home and disappeared. Many people assume they just ran out of fuel. This seems likely, but still, the circumstances were really strange. The trainees were being supervised by an experienced pilot who had 2,500 hours of flight time. He would never have let a group of newbie pilots get that far away from their base. Even now, people still debate what could have happened. Some insist the pilots ran into something supernatural out there in the Bermuda Triangle. But who knows? And here's another freaky thing that happened there which no expert has been able to explain. Time travel. In 1970, Bruce Gernon was flying a plane from Andros Island to the Florida coast. When he was at 11,500 feet, a giant cloud appeared in front of him. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and he had no choice but to fly through it. As soon as he did, the plane was surrounded by darkness. It was as if the day had turned to night in a split second. Suddenly, Bruce began to see white flashes of light around him. They were so bright that they lit up the entire sky. But they weren't lightning bolts, although he couldn't really explain what they were. The plane continued through the strange cloud for almost a half an hour. Bruce noticed that the cloud changed shape during this time. The space around the plane turned into a tunnel. Then the tunnel started narrowing. Bruce became really tense as he tried to cope with the plane's controls. All his instruments and navigation equipment were going crazy, and the electronics stopped working. Then, a white light appeared at the end of the tunnel. Just like in the movies, the plane escaped the closing cloud tunnel at the very last second. Everything was fine, but now Bruce found himself in some white fog. He had no idea where he was. Then he managed to contact ground control. He was shocked when he learned that his plane was already in the airspace above Miami. It seemed that something impossible had happened. Bruce was meant to cover a distance of about 250 miles during the flight. This usually took 1.5 hours, but he had managed it in just 47 minutes, almost 2 times faster than normal. When Bruce landed, he went to check the amount of fuel left in the tank. It turned out he'd used up a lot less than the normal amount of fuel as well. Could there be a logical explanation for the time-traveling plane? Well, records show that a large number of sunspots were detected on the surface of the sun that day, and there was a strong solar wind. This could easily have made the electronics and devices on the plane go crazy. But what about the mysterious cloud? The Florida coast is a place where 2 large air currents meet. One has a high pressure and the other is a low pressure one. This causes a lot of storm clouds in the area. But people still debate how Bruce was able to cover the distance so quickly. Some people say that some kind of mysterious dark energy was involved. Others say it was a gravitational anomaly that curves space and time. Others think that Bruce is just a fraud. We still don't know the truth. So, is there really something supernatural about the Bermuda Triangle? Or is it all just coincidences and made-up stories? The truth is that no more planes and ships disappear in the Bermuda Triangle than anywhere else